Chapter 1385 Madness. Amon and the strange door of light were grafted together. His face grimaced as the darkness in his eyes intensified. At the same time, more slippery tentacles appeared under his classic black robe, fully showcasing the crazy feeling was completely displayed. Just as Klein was preparing to sever the connection between Amon and Sapphira Castle and make him maintain his madness, the corners of Amon's mouth curled up. It was as if he was saying, "Congratulations, you have fallen into a trap." His face was immediately covered with a translucent mask that was similar to the fool's uniqueness, but one that was even more illusory. Klein's mind tensed up, and without a second thought, he immediately used the authority of fooling without any regard for the consequences. But before he could react, his thoughts slowed down. He was in a dazed state that he didn't know what to do. Fooling. Amon actually used the temporary reassembly between him and Sapphira Castle to escape Klein's interference and activate the power of the fool's domain. Such an action completely exceeded his instincts and was more like a meticulous trap. Amon didn't seem to be crazy enough. This true god of the error and door pathways immediately removed the grafting of himself to Sapphira Castle, allowing the mysterious door that was tainted with hints of bluish-black to quickly fade away to prevent him from being tainted further. After dealing with this latent danger, Amon raised both hands, his thumbs and index fingers touching each other to form an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, perfectly embracing Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon's hands suddenly parted to the side as though they were tearing something apart. This seemed to be a heavy task. With the tearing sounds of paper, the area where Klein's body was in seemed to turn into glass. Under the intense impact, countless cracks appeared as they shattered bit by bit. This was a form of regression and the destruction of space. Unable to withstand it at all, Klein's body could only turn into paper fragments that flew in the air as the surrounding void collapsed and shattered. These bits of paper were instantly swallowed up by the darkness. By the time the space collapsed, Klein's paper figurines were almost exhausted. Of course, he also relied on the level and traits of the fool to forcefully escape the effects of blind stupidity. And at this moment, Amon had already split into countless figures. Some of them were purely avatars, some were replicas on the level of symbolism, while others were left behind from constantly blinking. At that moment, the sky above Klein's head and the surrounding wilderness were occupied by Amons. They wore pointed hats and monocles, blocking every single loophole. Some of these Amons transformed into old mottled bluish-black wall clocks. Some of them turned into pure starlight, as though they were trying to create a cage. Some extended their hands, doing different levels of theft. Some of the monocles glowed as they used various items that they had stolen from the past. Some simulated various abilities, either exerting limitations, interference, or attacks. In the Marauder pathway, theft was a core skill, one of its main symbols. The difference between it and a seer's control of spirit body threads was that, as one advanced through the sequences, not only did its effects and success rate increase, it also obtained a deeper level of conceptualization. At sequence 9 to sequence 7, theft happened on items. At sequence 6, theft happened on Beyonder powers. After advancing to sequence 5, theft happened on thoughts and ideas. At sequence 4 and sequence 3, theft became life, including parasitic theft at the physical level. And at sequence 2 level, the range of theft broadened to fate, identity, self-awareness, and Beyonder characteristics. As for sequence 1, theft could temporarily happen on time, anchors, and authorities. Therefore, when an error faced a true deity, he could also use theft that had reached the level of authority. With a gong, the ancient wall clocks paused in unison. This caused the surrounding environment to freeze, causing the destroyed wilderness from the sun's blast to become extremely quiet. Even the destruction was frozen. At that moment, Klein seemed to lose his body. All that was left was a translucent dark-colored cloak and a bizarre ice-cold mask. Under the cloak and mask was rich darkness. Nothing could be seen other than the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out. In such a state, Klein seemed to escape the limitations of time. In a frozen environment, he moved like a fish. Through various cracks in reality or concept, he emerged from the encirclement of the Amons. He once again used his fooling authority. This time, he'd fooled time. The ancient wall clocks vanished, and in the desolate wilderness that had almost completely collapsed, time returned to its normal flow. The Amons stopped their attempts, suddenly merged into one, and blinked behind Klein, preventing him from having a breather. His left palm reached out, and as he retracted it, he clenched his fingers. Around Klein, the space suddenly became shrouded in shadows, making it look like a thin fishnet veil. The fishnet veil began to twist and reassemble, as though they formed a sufficiently strong cage that trapped Klein inside. An illusory door appeared above the cage as it moved quickly without being fixed in place. However, Klein's figure suddenly appeared outside the cell, as though he had never been sealed by Amon's door authority. He had fooled history and had split his previous and future self. Hence, the one imprisoned in the cell became his historical projection. This was the scholar of yours powers deepening under the fooling authority. As he had relied on an advancement ritual based on fooling history, Klein's the fool powers in such a domain were stronger than when he fooled time and fate. As soon as he escaped the spatial cell, Klein immediately used the realm of mysteries to create a new divine kingdom of the fool. This was to stall for time and find a chance to stabilize his mental state. He had used the fooling authority multiple times, and the weak balance in his body was on the verge of collapsing. If he didn't stabilize his mental state as soon as possible, the will of the celestial worthy would awaken further. This was also a serious problem. At this moment, a huge crystal monocle appeared in front of him. On this monocle, layers of sparkling light surged out and flooded him instantly. Klein's mental state suddenly stabilized, but the price was to lose all his emotions and desires. He didn't even want to resist. All he wanted was to stand there quietly and wait for the impending destruction. This was like an ordinary person being injected with a huge dose of anesthetic. At the same time, an illusory book appeared in the layers of light. The book opened, revealing a sentence. Tormented by the Lord of the Mysteries' mental corruption, Klein Moretti had always been in great pain and a state of extreme exhaustion. After the intense battle, he has finally reached his limits due to the influence of his mind. He had decided to give up and stop resisting. Behind the huge crystal monocle, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and classic black robe, quickly outlined himself like a mountain. He looked at Klein, who had given up resisting, and his dark eyes turned lighter as the corners of his lips curled up. "I stole it. How is it?" Klein raised his head to look at Mr. Error, and he tried hard to open his mouth. He said weakly, "You were pulling off a deception from the beginning?" Amon raised his hands and said with a smile, "Unfortunately, you realized it too late." He made his thumbs and index fingers touch each other, forming an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, illuminating Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon solemnly separated his hands, tearing apart the void where Klein and the surrounding environment relied on to live. The void was like glass, shattering into pieces like the collapse of a skyscraper. However, all the collapsing and destruction circled Klein's body without directly affecting him. He was like a small fishing boat that calmly cruised through a storm. It appeared out of place and disharmonious, as though it didn't seem to belong here. Amon raised his hand and adjusted his monocle on his right eye. The smile on his face somewhat faded. A translucent cloak kept popping up and disappearing over the surface of Klein's body. He looked at the mountain like Amon, his eyes turning darker. "From the moment you entered Sapphira Castle and said the first word, you began your deceit." At that time, Amon said that he had taken the risk to release the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in his body, in exchange for the identity of Sapphira Castle's owner. At that moment, Amon didn't take the opportunity to continue attacking Klein. He floated in midair and looked down at Mr. Fool. Klein didn't make any attempts either. His tone was strangely calm, as though he was preparing something. "If simply releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries will allows you to enter Sapphira Castle at the cost of being half crazy, Antigonus could have done so back then. The annihilation demonic wolf, Phlegria, from even earlier could have done it as well. You and Mr. Dorr previously had countless opportunities. Clearly, it's impossible to invade Sapphira Castle by just making the Lord of the Mysteries awaken to a certain extent, and using half-craziness in concert with error. There's no way you can find a usable bug in this matter unless you directly get him to replace you. Only when you possess the door authority to go anywhere did you see hope. By creating a back door and using bugs, you could make Sapphira Castle treat you as the Lord of the Mysteries and give you the corresponding authority. Of course, this will definitely require the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries to a rather dangerous state. Without this hidden identity, you won't be able to deceive Sapphira Castle without any reason. After absorbing Door's uniqueness, you didn't immediately infiltrate Sapphira Castle to deal with me, who was even weaker back then. It was because at that time, You were unable to completely withstand the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, with you having just advanced. I believe you've already found a relatively safer solution. If I hadn't advanced to the Fool so quickly, you would have been able to enter Sapphira Castle in the best state to resolve everything sometime later. And now, you have no choice but to bring this plan forward. There's definitely a very serious problem with you. You took the initiative to throw out the price of becoming half crazy to, on the one hand, make me think of countermeasures in this direction so as to lay a deadly trap in key areas, and on the other hand, you also wanted to divert attention and use this opportunity to conceal other problems. You're not half mad at all. Amon quietly listened to Klein's words. Rather abnormally, he didn't interrupt him, nor did he attempt to attack. Only when Klein was done did he say with an odd expression, "You're crazy." Chapter 1386 Narrow Path. Upon hearing Amon's "You're crazy," Klein raised his head and laughed out loud. "I just gave up according to your arrangements. It's just that it's more complete than you think." As he spoke, an illusory brand appeared on the forehead of the ice-cold and bizarre mask he was wearing. It was a strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness. As for Klein, he was also enveloped in something similar. Under the translucent dark-colored cloak, more and more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared. They were densely packed and extended until they occupied the nearby sky. As his dark eyes flashed, Klein looked at Amon and said with a smile, "For me, instead of you becoming the Lord of the Mysteries, wouldn't it be better if we let the past him revive?" After his mental state stabilized and he figured out the key to Amon's surprise attack, Klein's thoughts of giving up removed his resistance towards the Lord of the Mysteries' will in his body, allowing him to further revive. It was precisely because of this that he was able to control Sapphira Castle at critical moments and borrow the power of error to avoid the collapse of the space created by Amon. Without waiting for Amon's response, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he said with a smile, "After you were corrupted by Sapphira Castle and showed signs of madness, you immediately recovered and could use Sapphira Castle to create the effects of blind stupidity. After releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries' will in you, you didn't enter a half-crazy state, as there are external powers helping you. You should have an extremely key important avatar. It might even be like Pala's choice to lower his level. It's sleeping at Adam's place, and it allows a visionary like him to personally protect your mental state. As long as the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will doesn't exceed the limits of what Adam can withstand, you won't go crazy here if you don't lose control there. Therefore, your most serious problem is that you have to maintain a normal connection with that body. Once it's interfered with, your condition will be in trouble. And this connection is actually very weak under Sapphira Castle's isolation effect. You deliberately showed a half-crazed state for 2 reasons. Other than luring me to find an opportunity in this direction and stepping on the trap you set up, you were also hiding this fact so that I won't be able to target this aspect while engaging in a battle with you. Of course, there are plenty of problems outside these ones. After all, you aren't fully prepared. If I had discovered these problems earlier, even if I was a king of angels with a uniqueness, there's no way for me to defeat you." Amon listened quietly and raised his hand to adjust the crystal monocle in his right eye. The corners of his lips curled up as he let out a sigh with a smile. Upon seeing this, Klein smiled and shook his head. "You truly are powerful, cunning and terrifying, truly worthy of the title of God of Deceit. If it wasn't for the fact that I had long considered what I would do when forced into a corner by you and had no other choice, I definitely would have hesitated just now. And if I hesitated slightly, I would have already died." In that case, Amon would completely control Sapphira Castle, preventing Klein from returning from the fog of history for a resurrection. Amon stared at the increasing number of sinister tentacles extending out from under Klein's dark-colored cloak. He slowly took a deep breath and said with a smile, "The Lord of the Mysteries in you is about to truly awaken." Klein's smile had a nerve-wracking feeling to it. "You can also compete with me on this point. Our next battle is very simple. It's a competition of who awakens the Lord of the Mysteries' will to a greater extent, a competition of whose control over Sapphira Castle is deeper. 50%, 70%, 90%, until we reach 100%. Then with a bang, we explode and he returns. What do you think? Are you going to take the bet? Let's see who can't hold on any longer first." It's very thrilling, very interesting, and very suited to your preferences. It's like the roulette that's popular in FASAC. 2 people, each having a revolver and a bullet inside. They take turns pulling the trigger at their temples. Whoever gives up first results in his opponent winning. And if no one gives up and persists until the end, there won't be a winner.
He will be the winner.
Amon's brows pricked up as Heap smiled without saying a word. Klein looked at him and said with a smile, although you've always been pursuing thrills and are known to be a risk-taker, you achieve your goals most of the time. Not only do you not lose much, you often gain a lot. And in the few failures that you do experience, you only lose some of your avatars and some items. You've never suffered any serious injuries or been placed in a desperate situation. Your every action is a product of meticulous planning. Even if you fail, you will have a way out. Does this mean that you value your life more than I imagined? You do like thrills and seek it for pleasure, but to do so regardless of the price is just an image you portray. How can a real god of deceit wager a bet with himself at stake? Of course, this is just my own guess. Perhaps it's wrong. Anyway, do you want to take the bet? Amon stroked the crystal monocle and made a TSK like Medici. You're really crazy. Klein replied with a smile. In the eyes of others, this is indeed insane. But to me it's just a choice. Compared to you, I'm more willing to believe in the former Lord of the Mysteries. He is a true great old one, looking down on the universe from high above and treating most of the living beings as insects. This would make him distance himself from reality. Besides, I should still have time to get the genie to be my witness. I'll get the Lord of the Mysteries to promise me certain things. To him, it's very simple and worthless. Having said that, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he said, I won't lose too much, just myself. There are always some things that are more important than others. Amon maintained his smile but didn't say a word. Klein then surveyed the area and found the magic wishing lamp and Trunsoist brass book among the floating fragments of the wilderness. He immediately laughed out loud. Look, I didn't get punished. This means that I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth. In fact, the laws set up by the Trunsoist brass book had long been abolished since the divine kingdom was destroyed during the star's descent. Later on, the Amons dared to attempt to use steel, but Klein's main goal wasn't to prove anything, but to show his determination, firmness, or perhaps madness. Of course, what he said was the truth. He was indeed willing to put them into practice. Otherwise, there was no way he could hide it from Amon or exert enough pressure on him. Amon smiled and said without a hint of panic, Sounds interesting. Isn't it? Let's begin. Klein replied without hesitation as his eyes turned darker. Amon's smile froze as his palms suddenly gathered together. Beneath his classical black robe, there were also slippery and sinister tentacles. His aura changed a little as his body seemed to have a dark cloak on it. At that moment, Amon became more like the Lord of the Mysteries. However, he wasn't competing with Klein in the progression of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries. Instead, he was using this to deceive Sapphira Castle to create a corresponding bug and creating a chance to escape. If the authority of the error were to take effect at the same level, it would often have different preconditions. First, the medium and target had to be similar enough. Second, there was a certain connection between the two. Third, there were certain logical contradictions between certain matters or objects. Fourth, some of the rules were indeed incomplete. Fifth, while not directly affecting the target, construct an erroneous environment as a divine kingdom. In this aspect, the restrictions of fooling were even fewer, but once an error satisfied the conditions, it would be difficult to defend against or terminate it. Amon now wanted to take the initiative to disguise himself and satisfy the first category. This was similar to the invasion of a virus. First, it had to make the other party believe that they were on the same side to avoid detection, and then paralyze any defenses to achieve their respective goals. When a fruit looked like a strawberry, smelled like a strawberry, tasted like a strawberry, then it would basically be considered as a strawberry. But in reality, there might be an exception. At this moment, Amon's appearance resembled that of the Lord of the Mysteries. His aura was like the Lord of the Mysteries, and his powers were like the Lord of the Mysteries. His mental imprint was also similar to the Lord of the Mysteries. With the authority of an error, it would naturally make Sapphira Castle believe that he was the Lord of the Mysteries. Suddenly, Klein's damaged the full divine kingdom completely collapsed. The grand and ancient palace and the model table inside appeared. The grayish-white fog beneath Sapphira Castle rose and enveloped the space. The grayish-white fog split into two waves. They clashed fiercely in a particular spot, producing vortexes one after another. They tore open a gap that led to reality. The power of Sapphira Castle was at odds with itself in this second. It was as though it didn't know which Lord of the Mysteries to obey. Amon's figure immediately vanished, using Door's authority to rush out of Sapphira Castle. Just as he touched the edge, his body paused before being sent flying backward. At the Fool's Seat, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he sat there. His glabella and the strange door of light around him became more obvious, as though they were corporeal. This released an immense convergence force that reached an unimaginable level. It was like an invisible hand that pulled Amon back. Amon's body suddenly split apart, transforming into countless selves. And in front of every Amon, an illusory astral door appeared. Silently, the astral doors opened at the same time, but in the endless darkness behind the doors, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared, blocking Amon's escape. At the tip of the tentacles, resplendent starlight lit up as they instantly enveloped the almonds. The almonds couldn't help but gather together, turning into a conceptual cluster. These concepts included but weren't limited to pointed hats, classical black robes, monocles, fate, time, keys, doors, bugs, and Trojan horses. Klein slowly stood up and smiled at the conceptualized Amon, who was now in a passive state. You can also awaken the Lord of the Mysteries as well further, but this is different from death. It'll definitely affect the body at Adam's side. A conceptualized Amon rapidly gained a physical form. He relied on the door authority to escape from his current state. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile, but he didn't respond to Klein. He seized this opportunity to use the error authority to deceive. Using an avatar outside that he had prepared ahead of time, it could be used to replace him and swap places with him. This was similar to the swapping of marionettes in the seer domain, but at this level, the principles were different. It wouldn't be affected in most situations. However, Amon still failed. He realized that his error authority had been forcefully suppressed. As Klein slowly got up, more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared around him. The smile on his face became more exaggerated. Right on the heels of that, Amon's eyes glazed over and the smile on his face froze as the crystal monocle lost its luster. At the same time, the cold, bizarre mask on Klein's face squirmed. The blind stupidity effect. In the next second, he grafted himself to a certain concept in the cosmos, and he used his authority to influence the corresponding environment. The surrounding slippery tentacles aimed at Amon, like revolvers. In Amon's eyes that were still glazed over, a supernova exploded. An unimaginable sea of scorching light surged out, shattering his monocle and drowning his body. Chapter 1387 Method behind the endless curtain of darkness. In the darkness with aqueous light ebbing gently, a young man with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face suddenly sat up as though he had experienced a nightmare. Dressed in a classic black robe, he stretched out his right hand, attempting to take out a crystal monocle from the void and wear it over his right eye. But this time he didn't obtain anything. His right hand paused in midair for 2 seconds before. He retracted it and pinched the right eye rim. At this moment, he heard a gentle but emotionless voice. To him, there's something more important than life. To you, apart from yourself, there's nothing worth caring about. When the matter develops to a point where one's life is put on the line, it would imply your loss. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up as though he wanted to smile and reply, but he ultimately didn't say anything. The voice continued. Born as a mythical creature, your lack of normal anchors is also a problem. This makes you know what courage and sacrifice are, but it's hard for you to understand. Amon's expression changed as he stood up from the slightly glistening darkness. He looked at the human-skinned glove that was thrown to the side before but seemed to be very happy. He retracted his gaze and curled the corners of his lips. This seems very interesting. I plan to leave this place and enter the cosmos. That place is much more exciting than the real world. Perhaps I'll understand the 2 things you mentioned as a result of this. That's very dangerous. Once you enter the cosmos, and before I succeed, I won't be able to provide any help. However, this will let you avoid him at least. The calm and indifferent voice replied without any emotion. Amon didn't say another word. He raised his hand and pinched his right eye rim and vanished from the endless shadow screen. In the ancient palace above the fog, as Amon was completely obliterated under the power of a supernova, Klein couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. If he had a choice, he naturally didn't want to sacrifice himself to revive the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. He hoped to personally protect this world and seek out the meaning of life again. Of course, if he didn't have a choice, he wouldn't hesitate to awaken the celestial worthy. He was certain that he could do this, and Amon was also aware of this. Therefore he didn't force him, and only attempted to escape. In the battle just now, it had developed into a battle of courage towards the end. The one who wasn't afraid of true death would yield the absolute advantage. Clearly, Amon wasn't prepared to sacrifice himself for this matter. After heaving a sigh of relief, Klein's face under the cold and bizarre mask suddenly grimaced.
Under his translucent dark-colored cloak, the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out were either hitting the ground or rising up high.
It was completely out of his control. He could feel that the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was rapidly waking up, and it seemed like he couldn't stop it. Even if Klein directly died with his will and relied on the powers of a miracle invoker to revive, he wouldn't be able to escape, as the Lord of the Mysteries also wielded the authority of miracles. At that moment, Klein recalled the words of Dark Angel Sasrar, which was also from the ancient sun god. The primordial one had awoken in my body. In the next second, at the spot where Amon's body had shattered, beams of light were pulled by a vague invisible form of gravity as they charged towards Klein. Some were worms of time with 12 rings, some were insects made of resplendent starlight, while some were just large numbers of light dots. Klein wanted to stop the Beyonder characteristics from fusing with him, but the increasingly powerful celestial worthies prevented him from succeeding. His body swelled into a balloon, and then suddenly became thin as paper. This repeated itself in an endless loop. The mask on his face became brighter and more bizarre. The slippery and evil tentacles that extended out from under his cloak increased and became more uncontrollable. One worm of time Beyonder characteristic, one key of star Beyonder characteristic, and one. Klein's mind felt like he was being devoured by an invisible monster, producing excruciating pain. Finally, a pair of eyes, which seemed to be formed from pure starlight, formed from layers of illusory doors and crystal monocles, rushed towards Klein's face, straight for the mask's eye sockets. Almost at the same time, the strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness appeared on Klein's body again. Sapphira Castle. At that moment, Klein, Sapphira Castle, Door's uniqueness, and Error's uniqueness, all had a strong inclination to congregate. Once they fused together, the Lord of the Mysteries would completely awaken and complete his resurrection process. Klein suddenly used his right hand to cover half of his face. His entire body bent down as if he was fighting with another self. With the anchoring and image disruption from his anchors, Klein finally slowed down the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, reducing the power of convergence by a little. The starlight eyes and the crystal monocle stopped in front of Klein's face, floating only a few centimeters in the air like planets revolving around the sun. Klein believed that he couldn't maintain this extreme imbalance for too long. Perhaps a few minutes or even dozens of seconds later, the convergence would continue without restraint, bringing about an unbearable change. Haha, this can be considered a form of fusion. Klein laughed in an unstable manner. Then he fooled the Trunsoist brass book, allowing it to enter a sealed state and fly into the junk pile. Right on the heels of that, Klein left Sapphira Castle and arrived in the astral world formed from symbolism and authority. This place seemed similar to the cosmos. It was dark and vast, but in fact, there were many unique aspects to it. For example, even though there was a sun-like star hanging in the distance, emitting normal light and heat, if one tried to get close to it, without getting injured, one would realize that the astral world there was like a black curtain. The sun was directly painted with pastel colors, and there were a bunch of concepts and symbols surrounding it. Furthermore, the drawing of the sun wasn't that nice, like a child without any foundation in art casually scrawled about. It was both comical and frightening. From another perspective, this might be a manifestation of the chaos and madness that underlay everything. As soon as Klein entered, he immediately sensed invisible gazes. Some of them came from areas protected by the world barrier, while others came from broader areas with obvious malice. The corners of Klein's mouth couldn't help but curl up. He suddenly turned his head and looked outside the world barrier, raising his slippery and sinister tentacles. This pair of eyes that seemed forged from starlight and the crystal monocle also moved. All of a sudden, all the attention from the cosmos shrank back. Only the hand-drawn crimson moon was left hanging there as it flashed with light. Ha ha! Klein laughed as he came to a dark kingdom filled with night vanilla and slumber flowers. At the same time, the Evernight goddess appeared at the borders of the divine kingdom in a layered, star-speckled dress. Her face was covered in a translucent black veil. She didn't transform into herb giant form as she'd looked at him at eye level before raising her right hand and revealing the bird-shaped, golden accessory. At the head of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, a series of illusory doors appeared in the bronze-like eyes, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of eternal stillness to land on Klein's cold and bizarre mask. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings entered a state of eternal slumber. Likewise for a majority of Klein's consciousness. All he had was a tiny bit of lucidity. Under such circumstances, he made the mask retract, and he transformed the cloak into a black windbreaker. Then, he made the crystal monocle turn into a pair of black gloves, making the eyes forged from starlight to turn into a cane inlaid with star speckles. This was only a change in appearance, but it didn't change anything in reality. Once the two items were separated from Klein, they would return to their original state. Of course, if Klein stabilized himself, he could accommodate them and change their corresponding concepts and symbols over and over again, allowing them to change their forms forever. This can't be sustained for too long. It just delays the matter for a while.
The Evernight goddess gently reminded him.
If the river of eternal darkness's water is used repeatedly, the Lord of the Mysteries will awaken even faster. This is because he will trigger some unknown changes and adjust his condition.
Similarly, the specialness of Sapphira Castle and my blessing will gradually be erased, allowing you to enter a state of eternal slumber.
It was as though Klein wasn't discussing his own matters. He smiled and nodded. Got it. The Evernight goddess said in a tone that seemed to be comforting Klein's psyche. Regarding this matter, the method Amon used and the actions he did had exceeded my expectations. He is indeed the true god of deceit. It's not that you have no chance at all in what comes next. You can first try to completely control Sapphira Castle, and pull the will of the Lord of the Mysteries to enter a state of eternal slumber. In the dream, you can resist and fuse with him. I can bless you, but the most important thing is still left to you. Becoming a great old one doesn't have any rituals involved. No ritual can change the awakening of the primordial one's will, but the ancient sun god believes that the order to accommodate them can increase one's self-awareness to a certain extent, increasing the success rate of the matter. First become a sequence 0 of a pathway, then control and fuse with the Sapphira. Only then do you accommodate the other uniquenesses. That's the best order. Become a dual pathway true god and then controlling and fusing with the Sapphira is an order that isn't good or bad. Only fusing with the Sapphira at the final step will be the worst choice. Klein smiled and said, "That's a good idea. As long as one wakes up, a Lord of the Mysteries will be born. This might be him or me." Yes, after completely controlling Sapphira Castle and entering a state of eternal slumber, I should be able to weaken the seal of the Western continent, creating a weak spot that allows one to enter and exit. The Evernight goddess didn't say a word when she heard Klein's words. Klein continued smiling. This is my choice. I had anticipated this day a long time ago. I will finally face him. Chapter 1388. A sudden gathering. The Evernight goddess nodded and didn't say anything else. She reached out her palm and grabbed a corner of the void and tugged lightly. A thin layer of a night curtain gently floated down, covering Klein's body as it silently seeped in. Klein silently took in the blessings from the dream for 2 seconds. He pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. He took 2 steps back and left the astral world. The Evernight goddess stood at the borders of the divine kingdom as she watched him leave. In the next second, Klein landed in the projection of the giant king's court in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. Then, like Amon, he walked to the edge of the grayish-blue door and raised his hand to create a blue illusory door. Through the door, Klein entered the forsaken land of the gods. Following the guidance of fate, he wandered straight to the peak of a mountain range. There was a huge crucifix erected there, one covered with a faint shadow. Klein stared at the shadow for a few seconds before sighing slightly. He bent down and picked up an ancient silver mirror that was placed near the huge cross. Then, he turned around and vanished from the forsaken land of the gods. At the same time, the Worms of Spirit, who didn't need to be on duty in Sapphira Castle, informed him of Queen Mystic's current location. Klein raised his hand and took out the magic wishing lamp from the junk pile. Using the ownership connection between it and Bernadette, he used another wandering to appear on a rather hidden island where Emerald City was. Bernadette was flipping through the latest album catalog from Intis. Just as she sensed something, she saw Gehrman Sparrow hand her the magic wishing lamp. "Thank you," Klein said in a very normal voice. Bernadette pursed her lips as though she wanted to say something, but at that moment, her eyes flashed as though she had seen something and prophesied something. Hence, She silently reached out and took the magic wishing lamp. Klein then took out a metal cigar case that had signs of corrosion on its surface. "This is your payment." Even without the eye of mystery prying, Bernadette could sense that the iron cigar case was extraordinary. She could roughly guess what kind of corrosion had happened to it. However, she didn't choose to accept it because of that reason, but she suddenly felt that she had no reason to reject it. She hesitated for a moment before taking the iron cigar case. If he was still in a rather crazy state like before, Klein definitely would have smiled and said in an exaggerated manner the moment Bernadette hesitated, "This is a gift from Uncle. Take it." But now, he was only left with that last bit of lucidity. He had to put in a lot of effort to prevent himself from falling asleep and not having the impulse to act like a clown. After leaving Bernadette's Emerald City, Klein seized the opportunity to wander to Backlund, to Dr. Aaron Series's home. Willa Septon, who was sitting in a pile of toys, raised his head and looked at Dwayne Dantes in front of him. His tears suddenly streamed down as he choked. "I finally feel the opportunity." He was referring to the opportunity for accommodating the Fate Pathway's uniqueness. Klein squatted down and said without any expression, "I am here to help you accommodate it. I'll steal your childhood and youth and allow you to instantly grow up. Then, by relying on a level of above the sequences but below that of a great old one, I'll forcefully help you to accommodate the die of probability. Of course, that alone won't be enough. It will require an additional fooling and use of a bug." The tears that Willa Septon dripped down suddenly stopped. He muttered in astonishment, "So the two choices are actually the same." Typically speaking, the accommodation of a pathway's uniqueness required one to be naturally born with it, seek an existence at the level of a great old one to help, or rely on a simplified advancement ritual to complete it. There was no other possibility. The Snake of Fate, Willa Septon, clearly wasn't born with the uniqueness, and only had the two options left to consider. His focus had been on holding a simplified ritual, which was to wait for the opportunity of fate. Who knew that this opportunity was actually when Klein was approaching the level of a great old one? In essence, it was the second method. With this in mind, the chubby child, Willa Septon, cried even harder. He felt as though he had been deceived by fate. Let the life school of thought's demigod send over the die of probability. Normally, with your luck, the die of probability should be by your side. Klein ignored Will's crying. "Let's begin as soon as possible. I don't have much time left." Will stopped and looked at Klein for a moment before he said, slightly choking, "Forget it, let's wait for the next opportunity. Given your current state, it would be a huge burden for you to forcibly help me accommodate it. Perhaps you would lose control on the spot. I don't want to face the Lord of the Mysteries. Okay, next time. I have a premonition." With that said, Will looked into Klein's eyes and said, "I have a feeling that the next opportunity will be better." Klein maintained his reverie-like expression as he said in a low voice, "Is this a prophecy?" Willa Septon's tears flowed again. "No, it's a blessing." Klein nodded slightly, stood up, and took a step back. During this process, his figure gradually faded away and soon disappeared. He returned to Sapphira Castle and sat on the high-back chair, allowing the grayish-white fog to envelop him. After surveying the area and confirming the states of the crimson stars, Klein leaned back in his chair in exhaustion and slightly raised his right hand. This time, he didn't create the fake world again. On the two sides of the long mottled table, crimson beams of light shot out at the same time, freezing into the members of the Tarot Club, the Hanged Man, the Sun, the Hermit, the Magician, and the rest. This sudden gathering was clearly beyond Audrey's and company's expectations. It left them surprised and alarmed. Before that, although they had come to Mr. Fool's Divine Kingdom on occasions that weren't a Monday afternoon, it was all planned. They knew in advance that they would be dragged here. They would have either applied for a mini-gathering in advance, avoid the full moon ravings, or treat Mr. World with psychological problems. It could be said that, apart from the first time, this was the second time they were summoned by Mr. Fool without any warning. This made even the slowest members of the club catch the hint of uneasiness and feel the air freeze. Thinking back to the World Gairman Sparrow's visit and the words of Mr. Fool's blessed, Audrey, Alger, and Zio simultaneously had similar thoughts. Is it finally here? Audrey subconsciously turned her head and looked down at the bottom end of the long mottled table. There was no one there. Although she was already mentally prepared, Audrey couldn't help but be stunned as emotions of uncontrollable sadness surged within her. In her heart, the World Gairman Sparrow's image had long since turned from a crazy adventurer and an extremely dangerous beyonder to a person who wore a cold and tough facade but was a gentle, powerful, loving, mysterious, and lonely man who was burdened with many friends on his back. She believed that amongst the Tarot Club members, she knew the world the best apart from Mr. Star. And now, this friend seemed to have encountered some misfortune, leaving behind only an empty seat. The Tarot Club lost its first official member. Where did Klein go? Leonard suddenly felt a little flustered. In this world, he was the only one he could befriend. Previously, when Klein suddenly appeared in the southern continent and threw the gold coin into the cathedral's donation box, Leonard had already had a strange premonition. He had the feeling that Klein was about to receive the judgment of fate and was bidding farewell to the past. This was the same as the time back in Tingen when they decided to step out together and face Magos. Old man's recent silence has been a little bizarre. Could something really have happened to Klein? With Mr. Fool's level and status, as long as there's a chance, he should be able to be saved.
Leonard's heart tightened as he suddenly turned his body and cast his gaze at Mr. Fool at the top end of the long mottled table. This mighty existence was still enveloped by the grayish-white fog, preventing others from seeing his condition.
At this moment, Emlyn, Katlia, and Derek also discovered Mr. World's absence. Coupled with the suddenness of this gathering, they were both shocked and puzzled. They didn't know what had happened, but their instincts told them that it wasn't a good thing. As a clairvoyant who had recently advanced, Katlia even felt that there was a certain problem with Mr. Fool. Mr. World isn't here.
Zio had previously mentioned that Mr. Fool and his few blessed were about to face a major challenge, and it's very likely that they would suffer a bad fate.
Furs was also somewhat alarmed, inevitably having a strong fear due to some unknown change. She had once thought that she would sigh in relief because of Mr. World's disappearance, but from the looks of it, it wasn't like that. Instead, she found her heart heavy and a little horrified. Only then did she realize that at some point in time, the world had become the pillar of support for the Tarot Club outside of Mr. Fool. It made everyone feel at ease when they saw him. Of course, some fear was unavoidable. As Justice Audrey and company turned around and looked at the top end of the long mottled table, Klein, who was already the real Fool, said in a low voice, "This is a last-minute gathering. Mr. Fool is very exhausted." Audrey, who sensed this, felt her heart tighten. She looked around and stood up as usual.
After the members of the Tarot Club stood up one after another, Audrey lifted the ends of her skirt with a heavy heart and curtsied at the end of the long mottled table.
"Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Chapter 1389 The Fool's Commission. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. The other members of the Tarot Club appeared rather solemn as they followed Miss Justice's usual greeting. After they sat down again, the Fool Klein surveyed the area and slowly said, "I will be entering a state of slumber." Upon hearing this, Alger, Audrey, Zio, and Furs felt like their speculations had finally been confirmed. Leonard, Emlyn, Derek, and the other Tarot Club members felt their hearts sink as they became increasingly flustered and filled with puzzlement. Of course, they weren't that surprised. The abnormal last-minute gathering and the abnormality of the world's absence seemed to indicate that something important had happened today.
Klein maintained his last bit of clarity and said in his previous tone, "This involves a war that's at the level of above the sequences.
It has something to do with the apocalypse to a certain extent." Indeed. Alger acutely caught the words, above the sequences. He had long suspected that there was another level above sequence 0. The one occupied by the ancient sun god when he had 8 kings of angels. Now, Mr. Fool had finally confirmed his guess and resolved many of his doubts. Katlia and company also noticed the hidden message in Mr. Fool's words. Those who had similar guesses like the Hanged Man felt enlightened, while the ones who had never had such guesses were inevitably surprised and confused when they heard it. However, they quickly combined what they had learned from the past and came to a realization. The Fool Klein continued, "Only after you become an angel do you have the right to know the exact situation. Otherwise, just understanding it will bring corruption." This made the Tarot Club members think of the words underground and cosmos. They were momentarily unable to contain their thoughts. Klein looked at the end of the long mottled table and said, "My blessed, the world has entered a deep slumber. It's unknown when he will wake up. Then what should be done?" Leonard nearly blurted out, but he could clearly sense that Mr. Fool hadn't finished his sentence. Therefore, he forcefully held back his urge. The Fool Klein swept his gaze across him. "Next is a long-term commission for all members. Spread my name more widely, but don't clash with the Orthodox churches. When necessary, you can choose to use a more concealed method to proselytize. This will aid in my awakening." Also, spread the news of the world being my blessed, and record it in the church's Holy Bible. Of course, do not include information that involves his personal information. Remember one sentence. The awakening of the world spells the fool's return. Klein wanted to increase his number of anchors.
This might be useful in the battle with the Lord of the Mysteries in his dream.
At the same time, he wanted to mold the world into a saint of the Church of the Fool, an angel beside the divine throne, so that this image could also greatly share an image with the believers and obtain his own anchors. To put it simply, Klein planned on having a believer contribute 2 sets of anchors.
After all, to him, be it the fool or the world, all of them were just an identity of his.
Furthermore, the image created by anchors wouldn't be uniform. They were different and wouldn't affect him. At the level of the fool, the church would spread the name of the deity, the fool's sacred emblem, and all kinds of religious teachings without any concrete images. As for the world, he had quite a number of identities, such as Gehrman Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. It wouldn't fixate on a single image. The reward is the convenience you have enjoyed in the past, the responses you received, and the corresponding help given to your future prayers, the fool Klein said without a change in tone. After I begin my slumber, I can still respond to my prayers in a certain way, but not every time. If there's something very important that needs help, pray a few more times. He could tell from Antigonus's state of eternal slumber that dreams could be projected outside. As long as the correct method was used, a sleeping deity could make use of the dream to a certain extent to respond to prayers. Regarding this situation, the members of the Tarot Club weren't stumped by it at all. On the one hand, most of them were either openly or secretly spreading the faith of the fool. On the other hand, it was very common to pray to deities without receiving a response. Mr. Fool's responses from before were considered extremely rare. They had almost never heard of anything like this happening elsewhere. To be able to receive a response through repeated prayers on important matters was better than most of the clergymen of the Orthodox churches.
Yes, Mr. Fool.
The Tarot Club members didn't hesitate at all as they accepted the long-term commission. Among them, Leonard was the one that answered from the bottom of his heart. He was most eager and impatient. To him, spreading the faith and biblical canon of Mr. Fool was to awaken Klein. This made him instantly find the motivation to do something else other than his usual work. At this moment, the fool Klein nodded slightly and cast his gaze at Katlia. The previous commission, to gather all the information regarding the hidden sage suddenly coming to life, is still effective. If you wish to take the risk, then go further and investigate the present state of the hidden sage. This will be very dangerous. You can reject it, and the reward is a wish. Katlia thought for a moment and said, Honorable Mr. Fool, is this related to awakening you? Is it related to surviving the apocalypse? Perhaps, perhaps not. I can't give you a definite answer right now. I just see some visions. This time, Klein didn't deliberately create a high-level persona of the fool, because he was already the fool. Also, watch over all your subordinates that are beyonders of the earth and moon pathway. Katlia fell silent for a moment before slowly saying, I'll accept this commission.
The fool Klein cast his gaze to the other side and said to Derek, Your mission is to protect the new city of Silver and New Moon City and protect the Rorstad archipelago.
The more believers I have and the safer they are, the higher the chances of me waking up. On this foundation, think about how to expand the church and spread the faith. Your payment is to become my blessed.
Derek's eyes suddenly burned as he recalled the encouraging gaze he had received from the chief when he pushed open the final door of the giant king's court.
He took a deep breath and said in a firm tone, Yes, Mr. Fool. Klein nodded and looked at Furs. You need to protect the Abraham family well to prevent them from suffering the temptation of the cosmos. Also, gather more information regarding the fourth epoch and figure out Mr. Door's condition at that time. Uncover some of the latent problems of the Abraham family. That's something I wish to do. Furs hesitated for a moment, but she still expressed that she would do such things even if she wasn't given the commission. The fool Klein didn't give his approval or disapproval. Instead, he said, If you're willing, you can write down biographies and stories of the world's different identities using different aliases. The reward for above is that when you have a chance of becoming a planeswalker and have to head to the cosmos, you will receive my blessings. Although Klein knew that he could use a dream to give a response to a certain extent in his sleep, he wasn't sure if he was the one who had the upper hand or the Lord of the Mysteries. Therefore, he wished to use verbal contracts of providing a reward after the completion of a mission on more important matters. When the time came, even if he was at a disadvantage, he would be able to make use of this sort of invisible promise to give an ingenious response. Planeswalker? Furs was taken aback. To be frank, she had never considered this problem before. What she was worried about was the digestion of the secret sorcerer potion and the Wanderer ritual. Soon she composed herself and said, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein then cast his gaze at Emlyn. The besiegement of the Rose School of Thought involves preparations for the apocalypse. It's rather dangerous. Even if an angel is participating in it, you have to pay attention to your own safety. Your commission is to try your best to gather blessings, auras, and items given by the primordial moon to herb believers in the Rose School of Thought. These might be more dangerous than a Grade 1 sealed artifact. At that moment, although Klein still maintained the fool's tone, there were hints that resembled a friend's warning. This made Audrey, who had stabilized her initial mental state, sense something different. Recalling what Mr. Fool had said to the other members, she sighed inwardly. Mr. Fool's humanity seems to have become richer just as he is about to enter a deep sleep. While Emlyn was slightly surprised and puzzled, Klein continued, "Apart from participating in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought's mission, I hope that you can form a pharmaceutical company and perform research on how to mass-produce the medicine with magical effects. If it's mass-produced, there's no way the products can be equipped with a magical effect," Emlyn replied instinctively. The fool Klein nodded. "Seek out a compromise. Your main goal is to spread my name through this pharmaceutical company. The reward will also be a wish. This isn't a matter of danger, but whether it's possible. The simplest solution is to give me 1,000 apothecary potions. I can form an apothecary factory for mass production." Emlyn mumbled inwardly before replying seriously, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein looked to the other side and said to Zio, "The apocalypse is approaching. Be it the Red Priest or the Demoness pathways, they will become active. Your mission is to rely on the official factions to investigate the whereabouts of the 3 Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Red Priest pathway. If there's a chance, find a clue to confirm the primordial Demoness' present condition. It's very dangerous." Klein didn't mention the payment, because he had already paid for it. Zio had her wish fulfilled by holding a ritual and becoming a Sequence 4 imperative mage. As for the 3 Sequence 1 Conqueror Beyonder characteristics of the Red Priest pathway, Klein had previously learned that one was in the hands of the Sauron family, the former Intis royal family, the other in the hands of the Faceax Einhorn royal family, and the other was in the hands of the Lones Augustus royal family. Later, as a reward, it was given to the Demoness sect. Of course, this was only a preliminary answer. The corresponding situation could very well have changed. The Sauron family had already been in decline since Roselle's era. It might not necessarily be able to keep the Conqueror's Beyonder characteristic or corresponding sealed artifact under its control. Klein even suspected that it might have been obtained by the Iron and Blood Cross Order. The failure of the war had significantly damaged the Einhorn family. Klein didn't rule out the possibility of the death of a high-level angel or the loss of a Grade 0 sealed artifact. The location of the Conqueror Beyonder characteristic that the Augustus family gave to the Demoness sect was currently the clearest. However, Klein knew that the Red Angel evil spirit, Sauron Einhorn Medici, had been eyeing it all this time. Perhaps he had succeeded, or perhaps he was carrying out whatever plans he had. There were no clues to the corresponding Red Priest uniqueness at the moment. The last time the mysterious world knew of it was at the end of the 4th epoch, during the Pale Disaster. 1390 Questions and Answers. Zio had always been looking forward and uneasy as to what her mission was. She looked forward to it because she had already chosen to accept Mr. Fool's gift, so she definitely had to pay the corresponding price. Knowing the mission earlier allowed her to prevent unnecessary second-guessing due to the unknown, guesses that only led to greater fear. She was uneasy because she knew that the remuneration she received was too generous. She believed that the final mission wouldn't be simple and would definitely be filled with danger. At that moment, after hearing Mr. Fool's words, her heart finally settled. At the same time, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Investigating the 3 Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Red Priest pathway and their locations, and even confirming the present state of the primordial Demoness was indeed very dangerous. It was a mission that would result in a terrifying corruption if she wasn't careful, but it was at least better than snatching the uniqueness and Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics or directly facing the primordial Demoness. If it were the latter, even with the official factions supporting her, Zio didn't think that she could accomplish it. All she could do was write a will, ready to sacrifice herself at any moment. And if it was just the former, she could use a more roundabout method to obtain the information. She didn't need to encounter powerful existences with high statuses. As a Sequence 4 demigod, Zio was confident.
Without any hesitation, she immediately replied, "Yes, Mr. Fool."
The Fool Klein had planned on looking to the other side. After some consideration he added, "Be careful of Bansi." Without waiting for the Tarot Club members to start making connections, Klein said to Leonard, "Your mission is similar to the Moon's. During the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought, gather blessings, auras, and items from the Mother Tree of Desire from their members. It's equally dangerous." He only gave a single warning, without saying as much as he did like when he gave Emlyn the mission. This was because Leonard had a senior angel from the Marauder pathway parasitizing him. He knew many secrets and knew how dangerous the outer deities were. He wouldn't allow Leonard to act recklessly. Seeing that Leonard was about to nod, the Fool Klein maintained his tone and continued, "You don't have to do too much in promoting my name. You can even choose not to do it."
As one of the 22 high-ranking members of the Church of Evernight, as one of the few high-ranking deacons of the Nighthawks, it was very easy for something to happen if Leonard spread the faith of the Fool in private.
He would be misunderstood by his colleagues and cause unnecessary conflicts. Miraculously to Klein, the Moon Emlyn's actions didn't seem to be misunderstood in the same way. To the people in Sanguine around him, anything he did wasn't too strange. That's right. Leonard had already recovered from his previous eagerness and realized the cruelty of reality. However, he still wanted to do something. At this moment, the Fool Klein added, "You can share the stories of the world with songs and poetry." Songs and poetry. Leonard instinctively frowned. He didn't immediately respond to Mr. Fool. Klein then said, "Other than that, try your best to raise your own level to prepare for the apocalypse. The reward for all the missions is a wish." Although many Beyonder characteristics had fallen into the real world when the god of combat died, bringing with them a batch of Beyonder creatures, mutated monsters, and abnormal lands, Klein didn't know how many Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics the Evernight goddess had obtained from the warrior pathway other than the uniqueness, but at the very least, a number of the Sequence 2 angels of the Church of Evernight had the possibility of becoming a Sequence 1 angel. At the same time, if they had obtained additional Beyonder characteristics, they could still switch to the corresponding sequence of the death pathway. This would open a path for the saints to advance, not limiting them to just one pathway. Of course, not every Sequence 3 saint wished to become an angel, but Leonard was currently only a Sequence 4 night watcher. Furthermore, if the corresponding Sequence 3 horror bishop position was limited, he could consider Silver Knight and Ferryman. Klein had one set of the former. Leonard fell silent for 2 seconds before he slowly exhaled. "Yes, Mr. Fool." The Fool Klein immediately cast his gaze at Miss Justice, who had been waiting. "Apart from promoting my name, you have 2 missions. One is to assist Judgment and investigate the whereabouts of the Red Priest pathway's uniqueness and Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics, confirming the present state of the primordial demonis. The other is to work hard to raise your level. One of the missions is to increase my sequence." Audrey was somewhat puzzled about this mission. In her opinion, this seemed to be telling an ordinary person, "Your mission is to earn even more money." Furthermore, this isn't of any value to Mr. Fool. Could it be that he wants me to treat Mr. World? Just as this thought flashed across Audrey's mind, the Fool Klein added, "The higher your sequence, the more opportunities you have to awaken the world. In this aspect, you can make use of external forces to help. The psychology alchemists that Hermes rebuilds will be one of the choices, but you need to be careful and take precautions. You have to pay a certain price for this. You can give up the reward you received before. This depends on your will and thoughts." Audrey no longer had any doubts. After a moment of silence, she nodded solemnly. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein's gaze landed on Alger. "You will know what your mission is in time to come." Klein had already foreseen the corresponding scene. Without waiting for Alger to speak, he continued, "You can bring the Sea God scepter, but during this period of time, all the prayers of the Sea God believers will be transferred to the sun," directly pointing at me. Although Alger still couldn't accurately guess what his mission was, he already had a vague premonition. After a moment of thought, he replied in an upright manner, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein retracted his gaze and looked around before slowly saying, "After this, on the first Monday afternoon of every month, you can still gather here, but there will be no convener. If you need to do a private mini-discussion, pray in advance and wait for a response." At this point, the Fool Klein closed his eyes and said, "Let us end today's gathering here. The Tarot Club members couldn't help but feel a baffling sense of sorrow.
It was as though a grand ball was coming to an end. They stood up at the same time and solemnly bowed towards the end of the long mottled table.
Your will is our will.
Klein waited until they finished speaking before he dispelled his control of them.
He watched as the crimson starlight scattered and quickly fell. After staring at the scene for a few seconds, he conjured a yellowish parchment and a dark red fountain pen. After some thought, Klein simply wrote, "Dear Mr. Isaac, due to some complicated reasons, I might be sleeping for a long time. I'm sorry, but I might not be able to write a letter to you for a long time." With just that sentence, Klein stopped and made the pen disappear.
Although he had conjured that piece of paper, with his current status level and strength, he could sustain it for more than 100 years, even if it was brought to the outside world.
He closed his eyes again, summoned Isaac's copper whistle, and blew it. At the same time, he released some of the restrictions that came from Sapphira Castle. The skeleton messenger appeared, and every bone in its body trembled intensely as if it would collapse at any moment.
If not for the letter that Klein had handed over, it might have prostrated itself.
After the skeleton messenger received the letter and left Sapphira Castle in a hurry, Klein rubbed his temples.
This wasn't because the will of the celestial worthy had already escaped from his state of eternal slumber, nor was it because of the pain from maintaining his lucidity. It was just a habit.
Klein slowly leaned back into his chair and sighed. On both sides of the long, mottled table, Justice Audrey, the hanged man Alger, the sun Derek, the magician Furs, the moon Emlyn, the hermit Catlia, the star Leonard, and Judgment Zio appeared in the order they joined the Tarot Club. But this time they weren't real. They were only projections. They no longer appeared blurry, revealing their images from Klein's memory. Soon after, more figures appeared. They were a mature man with a receding hairline with deep eyes, a beautiful witch with blue eyeshadow and red blush, a middle-aged man with black hair mixed with silver hair, his voice unusually loud and sonorous, a woman in her late 40s with ear-length short hair, a youth that gamed on his phone while eating delicacies, a happy young lady who kept giggling, a civil servant who looked old in his age with a high hairline, a young girl dressed in an old-fashioned skirt who focused on machinery, a doll-like lady with a pale face, a teacher with soft facial features and bronze skin, a child licking on ice cream, a madam holding 4 heads, and an elder looking all serious at a bill. They either sat or stood, gathering beside the people they knew. In the flickering candlelight on the long table, they discussed different things, followed the music, and danced. Klein silently watched the lively scene as his expression gradually softened. After an unknown period of time, he stood up, passed through them, and walked into the depths of this space. Behind him, the figures, the candlelight, and the music faded away and disappeared. When he saw the strange door of light above the grayish-white cloud, Klein beckoned for the magic mirror, a rhodes. At that moment, the transparent or opaque worms and insects that clustered together to form spherical lights in the strange door of light turned bluish-black. It was like a thick layer of fog that made one unable to see what was behind the door. After Klein arrived, he didn't immediately enter. He felt as though there was an extremely terrifying monster behind the door, waiting to devour him. He raised his head and looked at the transparent cocoons hanging above the door of light. He looked at the modern humans with different skin colors inside the cocoons. Closing his eyes to sense them, Klein raised his right hand and closed his 5 fingers. The cocoons cracked open as the people inside transformed into specks of light. They flew out of Sapphira Castle and landed in the real world, into the bodies of those who had just died. After doing this, Klein lowered his head and looked at the magic mirror in his hand. "Are you scared?"
The aqueous light on the surface of the ancient silver mirror swirled and the pale words outlined itself. "No."
In the next second, a Rhodes raised his own question according to the rules. "Great Master, are you afraid?" The corners of Klein's mouth twitched. "Yes."
With that said, he took a step forward with the magic mirror in hand and walked towards the bluish-black fog in the middle of the strange door of light, passing through it.
His figure disappeared behind the door that had the unknown hidden behind. The cracked cocoons were still gently swaying. Chapter 1391. Facing eye in the dark blue waves that seemed to never stop in the berserk sea, the future was like a leaf, being thrown high up at times and smacking down at other times. In these waters, there were still some pirate ships that were cruising. They were used to such situations and felt that it was as natural as the sun rising. After Catlia returned to the real world, she pondered for a moment before spreading open a piece of paper and writing. She wanted to ask the Queen what happened recently. In fact, Before Mr. Fool announced that he would enter deep sleep, Katlia had already sensed the impending monumental change. Whether it was the sudden closing of the doors or the meteor shower streaking across the sky to illuminate the world, it gave her some inspiration as a clairvoyant, allowing her to see some blurry visions. Of course, she was limited by her own level, position, and status. She didn't have enough knowledge of what had happened, and she was unable to grasp what exactly had caused Mr. Fool to choose to sleep. All she could do was ask Queen Mystic Bernadette, who had long advanced to the level of an angel and led a mysterious organization while being in control of many powerful sealed artifacts. Just as Katlia summoned the messenger and took out the letter she had written, she was taken aback. At that moment, a purple light was accentuated in her eyes. It became extremely saturated and slowly flowed like a river. She felt that Mr. Fool had entered a deep sleep. Unconcealable hesitation, confusion, and sadness arose in the Admiral of Star's heart. For some reason, she felt an inexplicable palpitation, and 2 drops of tears unknowingly slid down her face. She seemed to understand something, yet nothing. She only knew that it was unknown how much time it would take for Mr. Fool to wake up from his slumber. Taking off the heavy glasses on her nose bridge, Katlia wiped the corners of her eyes, allowing her emotions to return to normal. She walked to the window and looked at the deck. Frank Lee warmly invited the crew to taste his newly brewed beer, but none of the pirates dared to try it. Thankfully, I sent Sealf to the Queen ahead of time. Now, all I need to do is watch over Frank. Without Mr. Fool's watch, I have to be more careful and pay more attention to him. Yes, I have to find something for Frank to do other than research. He's a first mate, so he can't always be working on something else. Katlia thought with a heavy expression. After considering how to deal with Frank, as well as how to reorganize the small number of pirates from the Earth and Moon pathway onto other ships, and not frequently interact with Frank, Katlia focused her focus on the hidden sage. Although she was already one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order, due to her background and the influence of the hidden sage, she had never received the trust of the president and the other higher-ups. She could only be an ostracized person who teetered on the periphery of the organization, who had her own circle and respective faction. From a certain perspective, her relationship with the Moses ascetic order was closer to that of a partner. On the one hand, she needed a faction and a powerhouse to project her will over the 5 seas. On the other hand, she yearned to obtain corresponding knowledge and materials. And to obtain the information regarding the hidden sage that represented a deity suddenly coming to life and confirming his current state would necessarily require her to become a core member of the Moses ascetic order. With my present identity, there's no problem with me participating in the internal decisions of the Moses ascetic order. Only by truly participating in these will I be able to come into contact with more information and elevate my own status. However, this will be rather dangerous. Even if the hidden sage's condition isn't right, and doesn't interfere with the Moses ascetic order's operations, the other higher-ups will also be subjected to the infringement of interests and be in constant suspicion. They will counterattack to a certain degree. There are at least 2 of the 10 pillars that I can't see through, making me instinctively feel danger. And confirming the state of the hidden sage will be even more dangerous. If anything goes wrong, I'll immediately be corrupted and eroded by him. The more Katlia thought about it, the more she felt that the mission given by Mr. Fool was difficult. She had always been teetering at the periphery of the Moses ascetic order with her identity as a pirate. In fact, she had her worries about this matter. She was afraid that if she went too deep into the organization's internal affairs, it would expose the fact that she was still in contact with Queen Mystic. She was afraid that the other 10 pillars would one day suddenly point her out as a spy and eliminate her on the spot. At that moment, Katlia even wanted to abandon Mr. Fool's mission and identity as one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order. She wished to return to the dawn and return to the Queen's side. That way, she wouldn't need to worry about this matter anymore. If there were any problems, the Queen would be able to stop them. Ever since she left the dawn, she had to shoulder everything by herself. Katlia had always felt exhausted as her shoulders remained heavy. However, this thought was quickly given up by Katlia. She sighed softly. She understood that she would never be able to return to the time when she was a little girl without worries. She wasn't only responsible for her own life, but also the fate of Frank, Heath, Nina, and the other crew members. Furthermore, she had predicted the arrival of the apocalypse. She hoped that she could become the Queen's most powerful helper and do something for this world. Katlia closed her eyes and muttered to herself, "Then face it. To truly integrate into the Moses ascetic order and gather the relevant information." After making this decision, Katlia no longer concealed her strength. She raised her hands and used a fairy tale magic.
In the eyes of the surrounding pirate ship crew, the future and its fleet became illusory at the same time, turning into countless bubbles. The bubbles reflected a dreamy color under the light's illumination. Then they slowly melted into the sea. Just like that, the future and its fleet disappeared from everyone's eyes. Many knowledgeable pirates were first shocked and stunned. Then they had a thought. A new queen over the seas has been born. Queen of Stars. Backlund, in a particular house. Zio, who had yet to sort out her thoughts after returning to the real world, saw Furza's figure appear in front of her as she shouted, "That mission of yours is too dangerous." Zio was taken aback as she instinctively pointed out a problem. "You didn't knock." This was the worst part of living together with a demigod of the apprentice pathway. Furz first reflected on herself for a second before confidently saying, "You didn't close the door." She pointed at the ajar bedroom door. "I actually didn't close the door." "That's right. This was a last-minute gathering. I wasn't prepared for it before the matter." Zio opened her mouth, but she couldn't say a word. Both of them looked at each other speechlessly for a long time, but none of them broke the silence. Finally, Furz decided to forget the accusation and focused on the mission itself. A mission that involves Sequence 1 and a uniqueness is too dangerous. With that said, she recalled that Zio had already accepted Mr. Fool's gift. Her eyes reddened uncontrollably as she couldn't help but mumble, "Remember to get my help. At the very least, I can help you escape." To them, the things they experienced before had involved very few matters at the Sequence 1 level. Apart from Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow, at most it was them being watched by he who must not be named. At other times, they would at most do trivial matters at the periphery of corresponding matters. They had never faced an enemy that could be addressed as him. Therefore, when she thought of how her friend's mission involved Sequence 1 beyond her characteristic, or even a uniqueness and true deity, Furz couldn't help but feel nervous and worried. Zio smiled and said, "I'm just seeking clues and investigating the truth. It's not like I need to face them directly." She paused for a second and said, "The apocalypse is approaching. We have to do something. Look, even Mr. Fool has fallen into a deep sleep. What's more, trivial figures like us. If I didn't quickly become a demigod, perhaps there's nothing I can do. Now, there's at least some hope. At the very least, I can try to awaken Mr. Fool." Furz had experienced many things and had long understood this principle. She had only been venting her emotions, but now she had calmed down. She thought for a moment and said, "What are you going to do next?" "Just relying on myself to investigate it will definitely be very difficult. I'll definitely need to use MI9's intelligence network. I plan on finding a suitable opportunity to let them know that I'm a Sequence 4 demigod. In order to not be suspected, I might need Miss Justice to give me some hints and make some arrangements," Zio answered seriously. Furz's thoughts raced. "I'll come up with a script for you. I'll act as an antagonist and simulate a lunatic who attempted to advance to Sequence 4 Imperative Mage, and then be defeated by you." As she spoke, a story took form. She immediately sat beside Zio's desk, took out a pen and paper, and started writing. "After I write up the story, I'll get Miss Justice to make some amendments and make it appear reasonable," Furz said as she wrote. As a secret sorcerer, there was no doubt that she could prevent their conversation from leaking out. Zio thought for a moment and said, "Isn't your most important task now to write the biographies and stories?" That's simple. I've already thought of plenty of scenes, and there's a lot of material on my mind." "No, nothing of that sort." After muttering a few words, Furz placed all her focus on writing a script for Zio so as to gain MI9's approval. Seeing her good friend focused on her matter, a smile gradually appeared on Zio's face. She then cast her gaze to the ajar door and heard her brother, Dio Dericha, seemingly reciting the ancient Faesak words. This was a requirement for studying law to become a lawyer. Their mother was instructing 2 servants to clean up the living room. Their voices reached Zio's ears, and her expression gradually became firm. Although she had no idea what would happen when she faced the MI9 brass, and even though she would encounter unknown dangers when completing Mr. Fool's mission, as well as the unknown future during the dawn of the apocalypse, Zio knew that if she didn't do anything or take on certain risks and just enjoyed the pleasant times with her family just like that, she would ultimately be drowned by the floods like most people who were unprepared. And now, there was at least a path filled with brambles, one that had a glimmer of light at the end of it. It needed the realization of sacrifice, and to grasp it with courage.
Chapter 1392. Yesterday, no more in a room beside the Evernight Cathedral in the southern continent, East Balam. Leonard's consciousness returned to the real world. After a few seconds of silence, he picked up the cup of coffee that had turned cold and took a sip. The bitter taste filled his mouth, gradually waking his mind up. Old man, what happened today? Finally, Leonard couldn't help but ask. After a moment of silence, Pallas Zoroast replied wistfully, "Error has perished." Error. Leonard almost didn't realize which existence Old Man was referring to. In the next second, he couldn't hide his astonishment as he nearly forgot to whisper, "Amon?" This was a standard true god. Yes. Pallas Zoroast's voice sounded like. He had aged considerably. To be precise, Amon's main body perished. Leonard wasn't in the mood to distinguish the subtle meaning behind Old Man's words.
He asked in disbelief. Why was there no sign of it?
He had witnessed the phenomena before and after the god of combat died. He knew that it was a change that would affect the entire world and bring about many terrifying monsters and dangerous regions. And just now, the only two abnormalities were the doors and windows suddenly closing, and him seemingly forgetting something. In reality, the latter wasn't strange at all. Most people would encounter something similar during their daily lives. Pallas Zoroast's tone sank. He should have perished in Sapphira Castle. Sapphira Castle? Leonard was shocked. The venue of the gathering he had just attended was inside Sapphira Castle. A war between gods has just erupted there? Amon actually infiltrated Sapphira Castle? Amidst Leonard's thoughts, his expression gradually turned solemn.
Old man, Mr. Fool was injured because of this and had no choice but to enter a state of slumber? Is he about to enter a state of slumber?
Pallas Zoroast asked in return. He didn't seem to be too surprised about this. Leonard tersely acknowledged.
The reason he summoned us today was because of this matter.
Pallas Zoroast fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "His choice to enter a state of slumber is indeed related to the previous battle of gods and Amon's infiltration, but it's not because of injuries, but because of corruption." Corruption? Leonard blurted out in surprise. Even at Mr. Fool's level, irreversible corruption can still be encountered by him? Pallas Zoroast regained his previous poignant tone. Everything has godhood. By relying on godhood to become a powerhouse, one can never escape the shackles of godhood. On this point, it's the same for you and me. Likewise for the fool.
Perhaps he shouldn't be called the fool anymore. He is equivalent to half a Lord of the Mysteries. Lord of the Mysteries. Regarding the problem of the mental imprint in a beyond a characteristic, Leonard indeed had a deeper understanding of it than demigods at his level. However, he still had several holes in the knowledge on this matter. Even though he had heard Old Man mention the term Lord of the Mysteries, he didn't understand what it meant. However, at present, he could confirm that Mr. Fool's level had transcended sequence 0 according to Mr. Fool's words during the gathering, and what Old Man had just said. His strength was enough to kill a true god.
Leonard cleverly didn't probe further. He changed the topic in a deep voice. "Old man, why is Klein sleeping as well? Are you able to wake him up as soon as possible?" Pallas Zoroast's tone was somewhat odd. How could an old and weak angel like me know about matters at the level of gods? As for the awakening, even the fool has no better solution, much less me. Leonard remained silent for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and took another sip. After a while he asked hesitantly, "Old man, do you have any way of stealing the artistic flair of others?" Pallas Zoroast scoffed. The definition of artistic flair is vague with no clear categorization. There's no way to steal it. However, if you change it to natural talent, there's a way. Forget it. Leonard ultimately couldn't do anything about stealing the natural talent of others to help him resolve his problem. Pallas Zoroast added with a smile, "If you can't accept this method, then you can find a natural talent that you want of someone who's very poor. Make a deal with him and give him the money he wants to exchange for the corresponding natural talent." "It's a little like a deal with the devil," Leonard commented objectively. Pallas Zoroast chuckled and said, "There's another simple solution. That is to spend money to hire naturally talented people to help you resolve the corresponding problems."
Old man, why didn't you say so earlier?
Leonard instantly saw hope. Pallas Zoroast scoffed. "You didn't manage to think of something that simple? I thought you had eliminated this option before consulting me." Leonard ignored Old Man's mockery. After some serious thought, he felt that this idea was indeed feasible. However, he soon felt a little guilty and uneasy, as if he was avoiding his responsibility. Regarding this matter, I still have to do something personally. Apart from inviting someone to write songs and poems, I have to write a little. With this in mind, Leonard suddenly stood up and walked to the door. Where are you going? Pallas Zoroast asked in surprise. Leonard frowned slightly as he said firmly, I'm going to the nearby bookstore to buy some poem anthologies. Ever since he advanced to Nightmare, he had given up the collection of poems he had bought in the past, making most of them nothing but decorations. When he became a spirit warlock, he began to collect poem anthologies that were suitable for some spirits to read, allowing him to chant the appropriate parts in a battle to create beyonder effects that worked in concert with him. Therefore, when he came to the southern continent, he didn't bring a single poem anthology book. He only remembered a few of those that he often used in the past. I never expected that, after becoming a high-ranking deacon, I would need to read poem anthologies again. Leonard sighed inwardly as his steps became firmer. Pallas Zoroast had never imagined that Leonard's next step would be to buy poem anthologies. After a while, he probed. Is this an order from the Fool? Yes, for promoting the corresponding legendary stories. Leonard answered simply as he opened the door and walked out. Pallas Zoroast fell silent once again before saying, apart from writing poems, you have to pay more attention to the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Leonard walked down the stairs and entered the streets. He looked at the pedestrians and nodded gently. Yes. At that moment, as he walked towards the bookstore, he felt as though he had returned to Tingen, back to the time when he was still a midnight poet. At that time, he had also walked along the bustling streets, preparing to buy a copy of Classical Poems Anthology of the Lone Kingdom and Selected Poems of Roselb. Backlund, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. After Emlyn White regained his senses, he found himself standing in front of a window. The sun was already dim outside, and the flowers were flourishing. His feelings towards Mr. Fool's slumber were slightly different from the other Tarot Club members. Other than heaviness, poignancy, sadness, and confusion, there was also the confidence that things would end well. Internally within the Sanguine, some of the marquises and earls were rather old. Even though they lived longer than most demigods at the same level, they were still in advanced stages of their lives. At this time, they often chose to sleep and use similar methods to extend their lifespans. The effects were pretty good. Therefore, Emlyn had long been accustomed to matters regarding slumbers. He knew that it wasn't equivalent to passing away, nor was it equivalent to perishing. He believed that if the correct solution was found, Mr. Fool would have a high chance of waking up. He looked out the window and muttered to himself, Mr. Fool has entered a state of slumber, and the ancestor's revelation is often interfered with. It's obvious that sheep can't provide help frequently. After a brief silence, Emlyn sighed silently. Indeed. In the end, I have to face it myself and bear it. This is the destiny of the Messiah. At the mention of the word Messiah, Emlyn clearly smiled with a self-deprecating hint. He then repeated inwardly, I can only rely on myself. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Father Yutravsky's voice sounded behind Emlyn. Time to set off. Emlyn turned his head and saw a huge sword on the back of the priest dressed in brown priest robes. The sword's length exceeded Emlyn's height, and its width was close to his waist. Together with Father Yutravsky's hill-like body, the terrifying pressure felt corporeal. As a sanguine earl, Emlyn recovered from his stifled feeling and nodded gently. Okay. Today, they would head to the southern continent to participate in the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Just as he replied, Emlyn suddenly recalled something and hurriedly said, wait for half a day. He wanted to gather most of the Sanguine in Backlund to discuss the pharmaceutical company. Bishop Yutravsky didn't ask anything and nodded. Come find me when you're ready. After watching Father Yutravsky enter the depths of the cathedral, Emlyn turned his head to the Sanguine that were following him to the southern continent. Inform all the Sanguine in Backlund to come over. There's something we need to discuss. Yes, Lord Earl, the Sanguine replied respectfully. After they split up, Emlyn turned his head to look at the altar and the sacred emblem of life in front of the cathedral. It was a simply drawn infant that was surrounded by symbols like wheat, flowers, spring water, and other symbols. This made Emlyn's thoughts suddenly turn adrift. He had forgotten when he started spending less time in his bedroom, spending less time with his dolls. Even his hobby of studying history became more targeted and efficient. This change didn't take form in an instant. Instead, it was slowly formed over time. It was something that made it difficult for others to notice. By the time Emlyn discovered it, he had already adapted to this new life. Emlyn retracted his gaze, raised his chin slightly, and shook his head with a smile. This is the destiny of the Messiah. Chapter 1393, where the dream begins. After returning to the real world, Alger patiently waited for the mission Mr. Fool had mentioned. On this day, he, wearing the pontiff's clothes and the silver-black mask, was discussing the internal affairs of the Church of the Sea God with Oracle Danitz when he suddenly saw a bishop enter. "Your Holiness, the Church of Storms has sent 2 gifts to congratulate you on becoming a proxy of God." The bishop held a tin box and bowed respectfully. Danitz, who had been secretly rejoicing over the malfunction of Byam's telegram, blurted out in surprise, "Where's that messenger?" "He left after leaving the present," the bishop at the door answered helplessly. Although the members of the Church of Storms often had impulsive moments, such behavior was still quite rare. Alger nodded slightly and said, "If they don't view us as enemies, sending a messenger to deliver a gift is enough." With that said, he raised his right hand and gently made the tin box in the bishop's hand fly over. After catching the small box, Alger's actions suddenly slowed down as though he found it heavy. He slowly opened the container and saw a book made of yellowish-brown goatskin. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven, "Book of Calamity." Book of Calamity. After seeing the words clearly, Alger felt a little dazed as though he was dreaming. But very quickly, he understood what the mission Mr. Fool was talking about was. Alger sighed silently and looked at the bishop at the door. "What's the second gift?" "It's a ghost ship called the Blue Avenger. It has already moored at the harbor," the bishop answered without any abnormalities. The Blue Avenger. When Danitz heard the name, he instinctively cast his gaze at the pontiff, Alger. He remembered very clearly that this was the ship Alger used back when he was a pirate. This meant that the Church of the Lord of Storms knew that the pontiff Church of the Sea God was once their cardinal. Is this a congratulation gift, or a challenge to war? As Danitz's heart tightened, he realized that he was rather familiar with the other gift. It was the extremely sinister Book of Calamity he had seen when he followed Gehrman Sparrow. "Help me return a letter to the Church of Storms, and thank them for their gifts," Alger composed himself as he calmly instructed. After the bishop left the room, he turned to Danitz and said, "Oracle, I've received Mr. Fool's revelation. I'll have to complete a mission in the time to come. It will perhaps take me a few years before I return." "A revelation?" Danitz blurted out in surprise. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind. "Why don't I know about this?" Alger nodded. "Mr. Fool is about to enter a deep slumber. However, this will not affect responses to your prayers." Danitz was so shocked that he couldn't speak. Alger continued, "Gehrman Sparrow has also entered a state of slumber. After I leave, the church's matters will be handed over to Elder Derek Berg of the new city of Silva. You need to cooperate with him and write into the Bible that the sea god is Mr. Fool and get all believers to accept it. Our faith is key to Mr. Fool's awakening. You are his oracle, and you have to make an example in this aspect. Of course, he will give you a new revelation at any time and give you other missions." Danitz was a little dizzy and confused when he heard that, but he still understood the seriousness of the matter. He hesitated for a moment before nodding heavily. "Okay." After settling the matter, Alger stood up and returned to his room with the Book of Calamity. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed. He slowly removed the papal tiara from his head and removed the silver-black mask on his face. A few days later, at the crowded Byam harbor, Alger raised his head and looked at Derek, who was taller than him, and said with a smile, "You've been doing very well recently. The Church of the Sea God has been running smoothly." Derek subconsciously wanted to raise his hand to scratch the back of his head, but he ultimately held back. He said with some melancholy and reluctance, "Mr. Hanged, Your Holiness Wilson, when will you return?" Alger shook his head and said, "Everything ahead is still uncertain. No one can tell." Without waiting for Derek Berg to respond, he said, "You're already mature and reliable. I don't have any advice for you." Having said that, Alger paused before saying, "If the Rorstad archipelago encounters a disaster you cannot stop, don't sacrifice yourself in order to protect it." Ah! Derek was stunned. This was the most important place of worship for Mr. Fool. It was the new home of the City of Silver, so how could he give up just like that? Alger had already expected Derek's reaction and explained with a serious expression. "To Mr. Fool, the most important thing is the believers here, not these islands. To the City of Silver, the most important thing is the people, not the city." As long as you can protect Mr. Fool's believers and protect the citizens of the City of Silver, migrating them away in time. Even if we lose Byam, the new City of Silver, and the Rorsted Archipelago, we can rebuild a new city elsewhere and rebuild a new home. Remember, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. Derek was deeply moved when he heard that. He grasped the crux of the problem. He replied sincerely, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged. Your Holiness Wilson. I will protect Mr. Fool's believers and the citizens well.
Alger didn't say a word as he turned around and walked towards the Blue Avenger that was moored at the dock.
The ghost ship was a 3-masted sailboat that was still behind the present era, no different from before. Alger looked at it and looked at the crew members on the deck. He suddenly felt something and looked down at himself. He was wearing a linen shirt, brown jacket, and trendy pantaloons. He had a custom-made belt around his waist. Attached to it were a dagger and a scepter made of bone.
The corners of Alger's lips curled up as he took a step forward and landed on the deck of the Blue Avenger.
He then turned his head to look at the boundless blue sea, raised his right hand and said in a deep voice, Set sail! Backlund, Empress Borough. Inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Audrey sat on a comfortable sofa and watched her father, Earl Hall, her brothers, Hibbert and Alfred, discuss the recent developments of the kingdom. She watched as her mother Lady Caitlin constantly convened the butler and footmen to make final preparations for the ball. She didn't say a word. She wore a faint smile as she quietly observed this common scene in her daily life. After some time, Earl Hall smiled and looked over. What is our little princess thinking about? Audrey pursed her lips and replied with a faint smile, Guess. I'm guessing you're thinking about which dress you'll be wearing today, and what kind of hair and makeup you'll be matching it with, Hibbert said casually on behalf of his father. Audrey smiled and said, Correct, but there are no rewards. She slowly stood up and said to her parents and brothers, I'm going upstairs to change into my gown. Earl Hall smiled and nodded. There's no hurry. Everyone believes that you're worth the wait. Audrey bit her lower lip and maintained her smile as she walked towards the door. When she was about to leave the room, she paused and looked back. Her parents and her 2 brothers continued with their discussion or arrangements. Audrey's gaze froze as she slowly retracted her gaze. She walked out of the room and went upstairs to the bedroom. Susie was already waiting there. Audrey inhaled indiscernibly and raised her right hand. She used her index finger to draw lines of faint light. They seemed to come from the deepest part of a dreamscape. A few seconds later, the faint glow turned into a blonde, green-eyed, abnormally beautiful girl, Audrey Hall. But unlike Audrey, this girl still carried a little childishness and a slight romantic bearing. Good evening, Miss Justice. The girl greeted her cheerfully. Audrey smiled and replied, Good evening, Miss Audrey. After the last-minute tarot gathering, she finally made up her mind to advance to Dreamweaver and prepare to split an identity to accompany her family. She would stay away from them and not let the various dangerous matters she had attracted affect them. After staring at her for 2 seconds, she turned to look at the golden retriever beside her and said, Susie, are you sure you want to follow me? Yes, we are friends forever, Susie replied seriously. Audrey didn't say another word. She split off a virtual person and entered Susie's body of heart and mind, which she opened up for Audrey. Then, she raised her hand again and outlined another Susie in midair. The moment Susie formed, she opened her mouth and let out a woof. Audrey retracted her gaze and looked at herself. After a moment of silence, although she knew that their thoughts and ideas were synced, she couldn't help but say to the blonde girl in front of her, I'll leave it to you in the future. Remember to wheedle to father often and get him to not be so busy. He's not young anymore, so he needs to be mindful of his health. He can hand over many things to Hibbert and Alfred or the butlers. Also, slowly counsel mother and tell her that she doesn't have to pay too much attention to the opinions of others. She doesn't have to maintain a perfect image at social events. It would be very tiring. Yes, don't forget about Hibbert. Cheer him up often and don't let him be so gloomy. He shouldn't complicate matters too much from overthinking things. Alfred won't threaten his position. Alfred, he needs a good wife to stop him from taking any more risks. Oh, why are you crying? We've already grown up. We can't be little girls anymore. Audrey lowered her eyes slightly and smiled at her crying self. I know. After Audrey said that, she pursed her lips tightly and nodded heavily with a sad expression. Audrey retracted her gaze, picked up her cloak, and draped it over her. Then, she led Susie out of the bedroom and into the corridor. The hall below was lit with lights, and the guests came one after another to attend the ball. Lord Hall, Lady Caitlin, Hibbert, and Alfred were already at the door. Audrey stood behind the railing and watched silently for a while.
She then lifted the ends of her skirt and slowly and solemnly bowed to her parents and brother from a distance away.
After maintaining such a posture for 2 seconds, she straightened her body and raised the hood from her dark blue cloak to cover her face. To her side, behind her, there were bright lights and a bustling din. In front of her, many dark lights formed a sea of collective subconscious. "Let's go," Audrey said hoarsely to Susie. With that said, she walked into the dark illusory sea.
Audrey rushed out from the bedroom and cried out with a sobbing tone, "You must come back."
Audrey didn't turn back.
She raised her right hand and waved it, indicating that she understood.
The figure wearing a blue cloak gradually disappeared into the distance amidst the deep, silent darkness. Chapter 1394. A new journey. In a room of an abandoned castle. Sunlight shone through the gaps in the thick curtains, illuminating a pitch-black coffin. Suddenly, the lid of the coffin creaked and slowly moved to the side. With a thud, it fell to the ground. A few seconds later, Isaac Eggers sat up, looking rather lost. At that moment, he was wearing loose pajamas that had been popular in Lone years ago. He resembled a noble who had woken up in his manor. After a while, Isaac narrowed his eyes slightly. He looked around in confusion as though he didn't know who he was. He then saw the brilliant sunlight that penetrated through the cracks and saw the dust dancing in the sunlight. He saw letters scattered on the table, ground, and coffin lid around him. They were like giant snowflakes that blanketed half the area. Isaac got out of the coffin. With a puzzled expression, he bent down to pick up a letter and began reading. As he read, the confusion on his face disappeared a little, as if he had remembered many things from the past. Isaac immediately found a chair and sat down, allowing all the letters to fly in front of him to stack up like a mountain. He opened the letters one by one, reading them one after another. There would be pauses in between as he fell deep in thought as if he was seriously recalling something. The sunlight that passed through the gap in the curtains gradually dimmed. After a long time, it shone inside again. At that moment, Isaac finally finished reading all the letters and completed the long contemplations that resembled cogitation.
He looked at the letters that had been stacked on the table and slowly let out a long sigh.
Following that, he took out a piece of paper, a fountain pen, and some ink that he could still use.
He wrote with a warm expression, "I've already woken up and received all your letters.
They made me recall who I am and who you are. I also remember many memories of the past. Your experiences, no matter how complicated and exciting, have exceeded my imagination. It also makes me understand some of the problems that previously plagued me. I can feel your joy, your exhaustion, your faith in life, and the heavy responsibility that you have borne from your letters. I can roughly guess why you ultimately made that choice. If it were me, I might not even be able to make such a decision. From the beginning, you've been a guardian.
You mimicked others until you were mimicked by others.
Next, I will begin a journey to pursue the past and witness the changes in this world. You seem to still be asleep, but it doesn't matter. I'll write to tell you about the interesting things that I've encountered, the interesting traditions, and interesting people.
I think I should be able to send these letters to you via sacrifice." The tip of the golden pen reflected the sunlight as it rustled on the white piece of paper, continuously penning down more content.
Backlund, in a solarium of a terrace house. Melissa walked in with a girl who was clearly less than 10 years old. "Aunt Melissa, why here?" the little girl asked, puzzled. All the stories I heard had mysterious rituals held in the basement. With her hair tied up, the bespectacled Melissa smiled and said, "Those are unconventional mysticism rituals."
She pointed at the altar that had been set up and the unlit candles and said, "You may begin."
"Really?" The little girl tilted her head to look at the bright sunshine outside the window. "Do we need to draw the curtains?" "There's no need. It's pretty good this way." After Melissa answered, she smiled at the little girl while she awkwardly mimicked her usual method of holding rituals in a clumsy and unfamiliar manner. During this process, she would instruct her from time to time and even personally help her to complete the pre-ritual preparations. "All right, repeat after me." Melissa took a deep breath as her expression gradually turned staid. "Yes, yes." The little girl tried her best to appear stern. Melissa looked at the candle flames on the altar for a few seconds before slowly reciting in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. De pool that done belong to Dizella." The little girl had never learned ancient Hermes before. Although she tried her best to imitate her aunt, she still didn't know what she was saying.
The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. Melissa continued reciting. Demestawies luler apove the grey fog. The little girl recited in all seriousness. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. After Melissa finished reciting, the candle at the end didn't wait for the little girl to imitate her. It immediately burgeoned to the size of a human head. In the large flame, a slippery tentacle with a somewhat sinister pattern extended out in an indiscernible manner.
It was extremely slow. The little girl was stunned. She retreated and hid behind her aunt. Melissa pursed her lips and said with a gentle smile, "Don't be afraid, go greet him." The little girl timidly poked her head out from behind her aunt and saw the terrifying slimy tentacle gently swaying in the brilliant sunlight that shone through the windows.
It seemed to be attempting to swat away the dust or was waving at her.
"Go, don't be afraid," Melissa repeated. The little girl finally mustered her courage and stood in front of the altar. She recited the incantation she had just invented before revealing a sincere smile and raised her palm. The slippery tentacle whose patterns had disappeared paused for a few seconds. It seemed hesitant and somewhat out of practice. Then, it raised its head and curled up slightly, lowering itself inch by inch. Amidst the sunlight, it high-fived that tiny palm. The end. Chapter 1395 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 1/8. You have a chance to meet His Holiness.
Barton heard a man in a dark blue bishop robe say to him. No matter how hard he tried, the other man's face was indiscernible.
It felt like his face was covered with a gray, blurry gas. Of course, this wasn't an important matter.
As a devout believer of the Lord, it was definitely the greatest honor for Barton to meet a proxy of him.
This made him so excited that he couldn't say a word. His body trembled as he followed the bishop to the back, entering the hall one step at a time. Barton couldn't describe the hall in detail either. He only knew that it was very grand and magnificent, one that exuded an immense pressure. He could only bow his head obediently. Finally, he arrived in front of the steps. At that moment, he seemed to receive permission as he subconsciously raised his head. Then, he saw a golden retriever. This dog wore a deep blue, gorgeous robe that resembled a curtain. It wore a papal tiara with many gems embedded in it. It sat on a huge throne and watched him quietly. Oh. Barton was stunned. This is the pontiff? Barton was shocked and panicked, a strong sense of fear rising in his heart.
He opened his eyes abruptly and saw the morning light illuminating the ceiling.
Phew!
Barton sat up, panting slightly, trying to extricate himself from the influences of the dream as quickly as possible.
What happened?
His wife sensed something amiss and got up.
Barton shook his head. A nightmare. He didn't tell his wife the truth. He dreamed that the pontiff was a golden retriever.
He could bet that his wife would say in horror, "How can you have such sacrilegious thoughts?" If that were to happen, he could only shrug his shoulders and say, "Just kidding.
I can't bring my troubles into my family life. This is a paradise for humans, meant for relaxing. Moreover, women can hardly understand more profound questions. They have traits in being perceptive to thoughts and love." Barton didn't dwell on the contents of his dream anymore. He got out of bed and went to the bathroom to brush his teeth. After breakfast, he kissed his wife and children before leaving his residence and taking a trackless public carriage to the working district at the edge of the city. He was under the employment of the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation with a sizable salary. In places like the capital of Eastchester County, Stone City, he was considered to be upper middle class. On the way, Barton studied the streets outside out of boredom. Due to not being directly affected by the war, Stone City still retained its former prosperity. Carriages, bicycles, pedestrians, and wild dogs came and went. It was lively and noisy. Barton was already used to such a scene. He didn't have much of an impression of it, but the dream from last night made him uncomfortable every time he saw a dog on the street. It was as if it was the incarnation of the pontiff, one that he needed to bow to and greet. "Holy Lord of Storms, please forgive your penitent servant." Barton raised his right hand, clenched his fist, and gently struck his left chest. After a while, he arrived at the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. As he greeted his colleagues, he walked into his office. After hanging up his hat and coat, Barton relaxed and leisurely prepared some special black tea for himself. He was almost middle-aged, and his energy was dropping. He always hoped to use a simpler method to supplement his body without suffering any hardship. After preparing the black tea, Barton picked up a few newspapers on the desk and wanted to prep himself before starting work. The economic situation in Backland last season has greatly improved. Another pirate at the level of king has appeared in the Sonia Sea and the Berserk Sea, Queen of Stars. Desi Bay Fruits Trade Fair. After reading the newspaper slowly, Barton took a sip of black tea and started his work. A letter from Vernal? Barton found a letter from an old friend as he examined the documents on his table. He was an archaeologist who had a close relationship with the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. Barton immediately took out a letter cutter, took out the letter, and read it seriously. My dear friend, my students and I found some interesting ruins in the mountains of Civilaus County. Perhaps they originated from refugees from the Fourth Epoch. In that period of history that we don't know much about, they left the city for reasons unbeknown to us. They entered the forests and stopped interacting with the outside world again. They existed in the form of a tribe. They might still be guarding something, but it has long been drowned out by time, leaving behind only ruins and corpses. My students and I will excavate this place while employing conservation practices. We hope to find something more useful that can help us restore the history of the Fourth Epoch. I wonder if your foundation is interested in this. Here, I solemnly invite you to send a team over to confirm if our work is real and effective. Going into the mountains. The first thing that surfaced in Barton's mind was not the relics or the history, but the buzzing mosquitoes, the humid, dark environment, and the camp that became a temptation to the wild beasts. He shook his head and picked up a pen and paper. He prepared to file this letter and send it to his superiors. Chapter 1396 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 2/8 After drafting the document's header, Barton was preparing to add some details into the document when he realized that Vernal hadn't submitted any supporting information. Does he think that he can apply for funding with just a letter by simply relying on his relationship with the foundation? Barton looked around the table and muttered to himself in puzzlement. In his opinion, Vernal wasn't an arrogant archaeologist. Apart from being feisty and impatient, he was considered a typical lone gentleman in all other aspects. Under normal circumstances, when one requested funding from the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation, they had to provide a lot of information, such as photos, ancient supplementary documents, and other related information other than a cover letter that described the project. Otherwise, the foundation wouldn't be able to do a review and make a decision, much less spend large amounts of gold pounds to send a team to the project location for inspection. Or rather, could it be that Vernal Fnar was just too careless and forgot to send the information out as well? Of course, with the relationship between Vernal and the Foundation, it's entirely possible the upper management will send a person or two to arrange a meeting to verify the information when they see it. Yes, as a friend, I should still help him. Barton shook his head and didn't think further. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf. He then stretched out his right palm and used his fingers to stroke the back of a book spine, selecting the information he needed. Finally, he took out a few books and journals, and combined his various viewpoints to give a detailed description of the history of the Civilaus mountain range in the document he was about to submit. In the scientific community, there's a common viewpoint. In a period that's unknown to be long or short, the Solomon Empire and the Tudor dynasty coexisted in the northern continent, and their border could very likely be situated where the Hornacis mountain range and the Phainopata highlands are today. There's a high chance that the Hornacis mountain range's extension in Civilaus County was a contested ground between both parties. Barton didn't endorse Vernal. He only provided references to show that there were indeed possible ruins of the Fourth Epoch in the mountains of Civilaus County. This way, if it was proven that Vernal was lying, no one would hold him responsible, because all of the descriptions came from famous historians. Barton had only extracted snippets in a selective fashion. At the end of the document, he listed out his references. Private Historical Research of Civilaus County, Isaac Eggers, Koei University's Department of History lecturer. After completing this document, Barton read through it from top to bottom and modified his choice of words and certain sentences. Then, he took the draft and entered the clerk's room next door. He asked them to type up a formal document with mechanical typewriters. The Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation had always hired plenty of female employees. From the lowest level of ordinary clerks to the deputy director of the upper echelons, at least half of them were female. Barton actually had some things to say about this, but he didn't, nor did he dare to object. He could only choose to accept the state of things. Of course, he had to admit that when he needed to wait, it was quite nice watching these young female clerks busying themselves. At least it enriches the colors here. As Barton listened to the tapping sounds, he mumbled silently. Once the documents were done, he signed and submitted them. Then, just like before, he continued with his work as usual. This included but wasn't limited to the trial projects, providing professional opinions and gathering research materials for the Foundation's papers and commentary. A day quickly passed, and Barton left the company at 6 in the evening. He took a public carriage and returned home after an hour. This was a common occurrence in all the major cities in Lone. That was why high tea became a trend. After lunchtime from 12 to 1, it would be 7:30 or 8 in the evening before people reached home. If not for high tea sessions, most people would definitely be abnormally hungry. Of course, this was only limited to the middle class and above. Many poor people might only eat 2 meals a day. Moreover, couples with the conditions to work would both be working. They would have to prepare dinner after returning home at around 8 in the evening. And the food wasn't for their enjoyment. "Vernal came to visit you in the afternoon," Barton's wife said casually as she helped him take off his coat and hat. "Vernal?" Barton was taken aback momentarily. The archaeologist who discovered a fourth epoch ruins in Civilhouse County had returned to Eastchester County? As soon as he said that, Barton frowned and muttered to himself, he really did forget to send the information, so he came back personally? No, there's no need to go through so much trouble. The Royal Mail is rather reliable. Besides, he should know that I'll definitely be at the Foundation if it's not a weekend. Yes, I might have been sent elsewhere for an inspection review. With this in mind, Barton asked, "Where is he?" "He only waited in your study for 15 minutes before he left," Barton's wife said. Barton pressed, "Did he say which hotel he's living in? When will he come again?" The archaeologist, Vernal, was from Eastchester County, but he wasn't a Stone resident. He didn't have a place here. He didn't say. He seemed to be in a hurry. Barton's wife paused for a moment before continuing. He looked very impatient. Barton touched his receding hairline and nodded gently. "I'll be in the study." His study was on the second floor, and there were many bookshelves and some porcelain placed there. He wasn't too passionate about porcelain, but he actively searched for unique items. After some searching, Barton didn't find any note or letter left behind by Vernal. He quickly threw the matter to the back of his mind. This was his usual rule. He tried not to be troubled by work once he got home. After dinner, he shared a beautiful time with his wife and children, then quickly washed up and went to bed. In the dead of night, he suddenly woke up and opened his eyes. Ever since the danger he encountered during an archaeological excavation 10 years ago, Barton had gained a sense of awareness, spiritual perception, that exceeded what ordinary people had. He could always sense some movements that others couldn't detect. For example, others might realize that someone was looking for them when visitors arrived at the door, but Barton could sense whether the other party was related to him once they walked down the corridor. Someone sneaked in. Barton suddenly sat up, his eyes wide open. He looked at his wife who was sleeping soundly beside him and didn't wake her up. With very slight movements, he flipped out of bed and removed the double-barreled hunting rifle hanging on the wall. After grabbing the rifle, he gently opened the door and looked down the corridor. This place was shrouded in the darkness of the night, and a faint crimson glow outlined certain objects. Barton didn't hesitate. He entered the corridor and scanned the area. However, he didn't find the burglar. Was I mistaken? Barton turned around, feeling a lack of confidence. There was no sign of any of the rooms on the second floor being opened. After thinking for a while, Barton came to the door of the study, grabbed the handle, and gently twisted it. The door opened silently. Everything inside was immersed in the darkness, resembling all kinds of monsters. After drawing the curtains, Barton carefully examined the interior with the aid of the moonlight, and he confirmed that the interior was exactly the same as he remembered. I really am too sensitive. An after effect of the nightmare yesterday? Barton exhaled and left the study quickly. Behind him, the curtains that were drawn lightly swayed, as if a gust of wind was blowing. The next day, Barton continued his daily routine. He kissed his wife and children, took a rental carriage, read newspapers, brewed black tea, read letters. There's another letter from Vernal. Barton felt relieved and opened the letter. However, there was nothing in the letter. The sender seemed to have forgotten to stuff the letter into the envelope. Has Vernal been suffering from absent-mindedness recently? Barton glanced at the envelope in his hand and suddenly realized that the pattern on it was a little strange. This was an envelope with a commemorative sense. According to what Barton knew, many high-end hotels in Backlund and Stone City would provide special envelopes and paper to their guests. It was equivalent to a tourist souvenir. Which hotel is this?
Barton put the envelope to his nose and prepared to smell the fragrance on it.
It was also unique and recognizable. In the next second, he smelled a faint scent of blood. Chapter 1397 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life, 3/8. Instantly, Barton's hair stood on end. Although he couldn't be sure that he smelled blood, his spiritual perception told him that this was the smell of blood. Vernal encountered some misfortune? Just like the archaeological team that I was in back then? No, there's no blood on the envelope. How can it emit the smell of blood? After a brief, extreme fright, Barton stood up immediately. As an ordinary person, he had only one reaction when facing such a situation. That was to call the police. As Barton took the envelope and left his seat, he suddenly remembered something. There were clear rules of how to deal with such situations within the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. If a project were to produce a phenomenon that was terrifying or incomprehensible, employees were to immediately halt everything and report to the compliance department. They would be responsible for the follow-up. Barton didn't understand why he needed to go to the compliance department. From what he knew, this was a department that handled provisions and audit projections for any violations of the rules. It had nothing to do with handling unknown dangers. However, the founder of the foundation, Miss Audrey Hall, didn't make many changes during the internal auditing of the departments. She only added this one clause. Therefore, the higher-ups didn't wish to argue with her over this. And obviously I'd prefer to meet the head of security, Barton muttered as he walked out of his office, heading straight for the compliance department at the end of the corridor. Knock, knock, knock. He tried his best to compose himself and knocked on the door 3 times in a gentlemanly manner. Come on in. A voice without any uniqueness came from inside. To be frank, Barton didn't know much about his colleagues at the compliance department. He only knew that they were cold and heartless. They acted quickly and easily caught any parasites within the foundation who tried to cheat the foundation for funding. Taking a deep breath, Barton turned the doorknob and pushed open the door. In his mind, the compliance department likely worked in an abnormally dark environment. Everyone maintained their silence and exchanged a few words from time to time, deciding the fate of a project and its principal investigator. However, the first thing that entered his eyes was bright sunlight, colorful decorations, and an open and bright setting. What's the matter? A black-haired, brown-eyed employee with no special features from the compliance department greeted him. He was wearing a thick black coat, which didn't seem to be able to withstand the cold winter weather in East Chester. In addition, Barton sensed that the voice of this compliance department employee had a Backlund accent to it. Either he was born there, or he had stayed there for quite some time. He isn't cold, mechanical, and difficult to get along with. He even feels friendly. As such thoughts flashed through Barton's mind, he said hurriedly, a partner of ours seems to have encountered a situation. The letter he sent only consisted of an envelope. There's no content inside, and there's the smell of blood coming from it. The employee from the compliance department didn't show any change in expression. He nodded and said, "Show me the envelope." Barton passed archaeologist Vernal's letter. Only then did he realize that he was being rude. He hurriedly asked, "I'm sorry. How should I address you?" The employee from the compliance department raised the envelope and carefully looked at it against the sunlight. He then casually replied, "Pacheco Duane, Deputy Director of the Compliance Department, an experienced solicitor. Just call me Pacheco." Without waiting for Barton's reply, Pacheco lowered his arm and said with a serious expression, "Indeed, there are some abnormalities. A preliminary conclusion is that this letter is from the Clough Hotel in the city. I once lived there for some time, and I know that they like to emboss Lavender Castle on their envelopes and paper." "Do we need to call the police?" Barton blurted out. Pacheco shook his head. "Not for now. Let's go to the venue to confirm the situation. This requires your assistance." "I don't know that, partner." "All right. I'll go with you." Barton hesitated. After exiting the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation and boarding a rental carriage, Barton found the silence rather awkward. He took the initiative to ask, "Pacheco, you're from Backlund?" "No." Pacheco shook his head. "I'm from Mid-Seashire. I just happen to have lived in Backlund for nearly 15 years. Why did you leave Backlund? I heard that it's the city most suitable for lawyers to develop their career, Barton said casually. Pacheco smiled and said, but it's also a place full of competition. All right, I was just joking. I was once a personal lawyer and partner of Xueqi's Cage, a steam car mogul. Later, he invested in the Backlund Bike Company, and I began to work as the company's legal advisor. Barton was suddenly enlightened. Miss Audrey has a large number of shares in that company. Did you get to know her because of that? That's right. Pacheco sighed. In the war, Xueqi unfortunately passed away. His estate fell into dispute. As his friend, I helped his widow and children obtain quite a large share. As a result, I offended some people. This made my situation in Backlund become difficult. Fortunately, Miss Audrey extended an olive branch to me and invited me to Eastchester County to work at the foundation as deputy director of the compliance department. With Pacheco telling him such matters, Barton felt a closer bond with him. He was slightly puzzled and asked, why did they target you? You were just carrying out your duty as a friend and a lawyer. Those people should aim at the widow and children of Xueqi's Cage. Pacheco laughed self-deprecatingly and said, I use some inappropriate methods. Also, Xueqi has other friends to take care of his widow and children. As they chatted, the rental carriage arrived at the Clough Hotel in Stone City. The location of the hotel was rather good. The street was beautiful and quiet, and they only needed to walk for 10 minutes to reach the most bustling streets in the city. After entering the hotel and finding the boss, Pacheco asked directly, We've come to find a friend named Vernal. Through their casual conversation, he had already grasped the general situation of the target. The boss frowned in puzzlement. If I remember correctly, there shouldn't be any customer here named Vernal. Barton quickly added, he's a little taller than me, and he looks very well built. His nose is always very red, and his body often reeks of alcohol. He described the characteristics of Vernal in detail. The boss recalled and looked at the attendant beside him. There's a guest like that, the attendant replied immediately. He lives in room 309. Under the attendant's lead, Barton and Pacheco arrived outside the room and knocked on the door. The knocking echoed, but there was no movement inside. Just as Barton was about to suggest calling the police again, Pacheco suddenly bent down and picked up a white soft tuft of hair from the crack at the bottom of the door. No, it wasn't hair. It resembled the condensation of fog. With Pacheco's fingers touching it, it spread out and merged into the air. At the same time, Barton, whose spiritual perception was slightly different from ordinary people, vaguely heard a faint male voice. Tamara? Tamara. Chapter 1398 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 4/8 Tamara. Barton ruminated over the name and wondered what it meant. He was no longer the same person who realized that he could hear sounds that others couldn't. He didn't look around in panic, hoping to find someone who was hiding and speaking in a dark corner. There were no signs of him constantly being prepared to grab a wooden pole and rushing over to strike the person. He stood on the spot calmly, observing the reaction of the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco. Pacheco glanced at him and said, Have you done any research in the history of the Fourth Epoch? A little, Barton replied modestly. At this moment, he didn't pretend that he didn't know anything about the history of the Fourth Epoch. Firstly, his character didn't allow for that. Secondly, his position was a direct result of his academic background in history. If he had any major flaws in this field, he might be fired by the Foundation tomorrow. Pacheco looked at the door and said, Have you heard of the name Tamara before? I've heard of it. Barton instinctively turned his head to glance at Pacheco. In the little-known history of the Fourth Epoch, the name Tamara has appeared several times, and its frequency is only second to Tudor, Solomon, and Trunsoist. From this, it can be determined that this represents a great noble of some empire in the Fourth Epoch. After saying this, Barton paused and said, Vernal recently discovered some ruins from the Fourth Epoch. As the hotel waiter was by his side, he didn't directly mention that the name Tamara might have something to do with the current abnormality Vernal was facing. Pacheco didn't respond. He turned to the hotel attendant and said, I'm a police officer in charge of a criminal investigation. I suspect that the tenant in this room has encountered some misfortune. Please open the door immediately. As he spoke, he took out an identification document and showed it to the other party. The hotel attendant was shocked and looked at the identification carefully. Okay. I'll get the keys. As he spoke, he turned around and ran towards the staircase. You're a policeman? Barton, who was watching from the sidelines, blurted out in shock. Pacheco looked down at the identification in his hand and chuckled. This document is 100% real. It was obtained through legal channels. Why do you need to make it sound so complicated? Barton habitually replied, I don't care about its authenticity. I just want to know if you're a police officer. Pacheco laughed. That depends on how you view it. This answer left Barton rather irritated, but as a typical lone gentleman, he knew that the other party was unwilling to give him an answer directly, so he politely shut his mouth. Of course, one of the reasons included the other party being one of the deputy directors of the compliance department. The two of them remained silent as the hotel owner and the attendant returned to the third floor. After carefully inspecting the identification document in Pacheco's hands and matching it to the face, the hotel owner took out his keys and opened the door. He grumbled. How did something happen? Nothing was heard. If a high-end hotel was involved in a murder case, it would definitely affect their image and reputation. They might even go bankrupt. Don't worry too much. Perhaps it's just a small problem. Pacheco gave him some friendly consolation. I hope so. May the goddess bless me. The hotel owner retracted his hand and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion, outlining the stars. Then, he gently pushed the door open. At that moment, the interior of the room seemed to connect to the outside world. A faint smell of blood filled the air. Oh! The hotel owner noticed this and could only use an exclamation to express his disappointment and fear. Only an environment like this can make the envelope not stained with blood have the smell of blood. This thought flashed through Barton's mind immediately. It was only then that he noticed that the furniture was neatly arranged in the room, and there were no obvious wrinkles on the carpet. It stood in contrast with the smell of blood. It didn't seem like there was a fight. A fatal shot? Barton's hobbies included reading popular novels, especially those that mixed murder and love. Therefore, he had a rather rich experience in such situations. And among all the best-selling authors, the one he loved the most was undoubtedly Furs Wall. In the beginning, the one who bought Furs Wall's few novels was his wife. Barton had once read through one of them and ended up being engrossed in it. Of course, he wouldn't reveal this in front of his wife. He would always use an authoritative tone, saying, "These kinds of novels are shallow and worthless. They're only suitable for killing time." Amidst Barton's thoughts, Pacheco put on a pair of white gloves and walked into the room. After surveying the area, this experienced solicitor walked to the desk and picked up the stack of letters with the lavender castle pattern embossed on it. He said to the hotel owner and waiter, "Do you know how many pieces there were originally?" "We don't replenish them every day." The attendant looked at his boss and stuttered. What he was trying to say was that after having the guests living in this room rotate out a few times, he had no idea how many letters were left when Vernal moved in. Pacheco scoffed and shook his head. He said to Barton, who was standing beside him, "That's why this world needs order and rules. If they used a set of strict rules, replenishing the number of letters to a set number every time a customer checks out, we could have used this to find some clues." "I don't understand what you mean," Barton answered truthfully. Pacheco smiled and said, "Simply put, only light can cause shadows. Of course, enough chaos also means an opportunity." Barton nodded and said, "Yes, Emperor Roselle once said that chaos is a staircase that leads one up. No one knows if he's the one who said that. There are too many people in this world who don't dare to directly express their views, so they can only rely on the names of others," Pacheco casually replied. Then, he picked up the blank piece of paper at the top and held it against the sunlight that passed through the glass windows. "I love dealing with people who are careless." Pacheco suddenly laughed. After saying this, he put the letter back in its original position. The next second, he took out a sharpened pencil from his pocket and lightly scribbled it over the letter paper. Before long, the traces of Loanese text appeared one after another, forming several scattered sentences. "I've been targeted. The ruins have traces of some religious rituals. I took away the items on the altar. It saw me. No, it's always been by my side." When he wrote these few sentences, the archaeologist, Vernal, seemed to be undergoing upheavals in his mood, so he had used plenty of force, leaving the most obvious of traces with his pen. Chapter 1399 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 5/8 After seeing the marks on the paper, Pacheco turned his head and said to Barton, "What happens next will be quite complicated. I will seek the police's help. And you can return to the Foundation and wait for further questioning." Barton, who was staring at the paper, wasn't disappointed. Instead, he felt relieved, and he hurriedly nodded. "All right." After reading the traces left behind by Vernal, Barton's intuition told him that the matter was very dangerous. As an ordinary person, avoiding danger was an instinctive choice. Of course, this was also because Vernal could only be considered one of his ordinary friends. It wasn't worth taking a huge risk and getting involved in this matter. After answering, Barton turned around immediately and walked past the hotel owner and attendant and arrived at the street. This time, he didn't choose to take public transport and instead boarded a rental carriage. Barton's trip outside was considered as a special matter. It was rather urgent, and with the deputy director of the compliance department to testify for him, he could make a claim for the expenses incurred. The difference between spending the Foundation's money and using one's own salary was two completely different feelings. On the way, Barton looked at the scenery outside the window and couldn't help but think about Vernal's current situation. Is he still alive? The room was filled with a strong stench of blood. I hope he's still alive. May the Lord bless him. If he's still alive, where will he be now? Where could it be? There. As his thoughts raced, Barton suddenly thought of a possibility. He quickly instructed the coach driver to change routes and head home. Not long after, he returned home. What happened? Barton's wife approached him with a surprised look. It was still quite some time before lunch, let alone getting off work. Barton didn't take off his hat or jacket. Without answering her question, he directly asked, "Was Vernal here?" "He came to visit you 15 minutes ago. I told him to wait in the study room and send Wells to the Foundation to look for you," Barton's wife replied honestly. Wells was their family's valet. And clearly, 15 minutes wasn't enough for him to reach the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. This was what puzzled Barton's wife the most. Right. Barton nodded heavily. He hurriedly passed through the living room, went up to the second floor, and entered the study. In the study room, the windows were wide open and the curtains were slightly rolled. There was no one there. "Vernal?" Barton shouted, but there was no answer. He jumped out of the window and left. Barton frowned. He looked around seriously and discovered that the books on the bookshelf were in a mess. It was a set of historical books that were split into three-parter volumes. Barton's habit was to arrange them from right to left, and now it was going from left to right. He took a deep breath and quickly walked over to retrieve the three books. After a thorough examination, Barton found that a page in the middle had been folded. He quickly flipped to that page and opened a corner. Scribbled there simply with a pencil were the words, "The refugees of the Fourth Epoch worshipped an evil god, man." Barton panicked and turned horrified. He stuffed the book back. Without much thought, he ran out of the study and towards the stairs, preparing to find the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco. He wanted to tell him about his discovery and get him to request the police to protect his family. After exiting the house, Barton slowed down and considered an important question. Where do I go to find Pacheco? The Clough Hotel, the Stone Police Headquarters, or the Foundation? After a brief moment of thought, Barton decided to return to the Foundation and look for other employees of the compliance department. At that moment, a rental carriage stopped outside his door as Pacheco Duane alighted. "We discovered that Vernal came to your house again," the deputy director of the compliance department explained quickly. Barton heaved a sigh of relief and replied without hesitation, "Yes, but he has already left. However, he left some clues behind." After saying this, Barton led Pacheco into his own house, went to his study, and handed him the book. Pacheco looked at it for a while, then gently slid his finger across the surface of the text. Right on the heels of that, he took out the pencil he had used previously and wrote beside Vernal's comment, "Call the police." After doing all of this, Pacheco stuffed the book back to its original position. However, he didn't push the book in completely. This way, the entire row of books had one book bulging out. "All right, let's return to the Foundation and have lunch. We'll wait for the good news from the police." Pacheco clapped his hands. Barton didn't understand the reason behind this senior lawyer's actions, but he didn't ask why. He really didn't want to get involved in this matter. He felt that he couldn't bear it at all. Barton then fabricated a few reasons to his wife before returning to the foundation with Pacheco to begin his daily work. When it was tea time, he had just finished an ancient books appraisal when he heard someone knocking on the door. "We've got some clues. We need to go to your place," said Pacheco, who was wrapped in a gray scarf and standing by the door. "Clues?" Barton rose in surprise. Pacheco didn't give a direct answer.
He spread out his hands and made an inviting gesture. Barton couldn't refuse and went home with the other party. Vernal came again. His wife clearly sensed that something was amiss and went to the door in horror.
"It's fine. Just some minor problems." Barton maintained his image as a man and consoled his wife. When he arrived at the study, he and Pacheco discovered that, yet again, Vernal had escaped. "Damn it, can't he just wait for a while?" Barton couldn't help but grumble. "It's all right." Pacheco walked up to the bookshelf and pulled out the book. Clearly, Vernal had read his suggestion, as the book was completely stuffed into the bookshelf. "I guess I know where Vernal is." Pacheco closed his eyes, smiling. Barton was stunned. "How do you know?" Pacheco opened his eyes and replied with a smile. "He accepted my bribe." "No, a gift." "But that isn't right either. The most accurate description should be a suggestion."
"Of course he might not accept it."
With that said, the deputy director of the compliance department walked past Barton and out of the study. Barton followed behind him subconsciously, leaving his own burrow and turning into a nearby street. At the end of the street, there was a house that had collapsed due to a fire. "They actually haven't started reconstruction efforts," Barton whispered. Pacheco put on a pair of white gloves again, and his expression became a little stern. Through the rather intact main door, he entered the half-collapsed hall. Black pieces of wood were strewn across the ground, blocking the lower half of a person's body. The figure was wearing a brown jacket with a red nose. He looked very stocky and was none other than the archaeologist, Vernal. Barton secretly exhaled and asked anxiously, "Why didn't you call the police?" "They're monitoring the police station," Vernal replied without a change in expression. Barton blurted out, "Why didn't you leave Stone and go to other cities to report to the police?" "They're monitoring the steam locomotive station," Vernal replied in the same tone. Barton thought for a moment and frowned. "You have many ways to leave Stone. They can't seal off a city." Upon hearing this question, Vernal's expression gradually changed as he said with a slightly ethereal tone, "I sense the will of that great existence." Chapter 1400 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 6/8 Great Existence. As soon as Barton heard Vernal, certain memories hidden deep within his heart surged out. This made it difficult for him to contain his fear. His feet unconsciously took a few steps back. In that the archaeological expedition many years ago, all the nightmares had started with similar descriptions. Just as Barton's body trembled and was about to turn around and run away, the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco Duane, brought up a question. "Since you've already sensed the will of that great existence, why didn't you reconcile with the fourth epoch refugees who are pursuing you?" Vernal's breathing suddenly became heavier, as if a faint white fog had spewed out. His voice also became louder. Their faith wasn't accepted with their whole body and mind. They still had some reservations. As Vernal spoke, a faint white fog spread out from the half-collapsed house, emitting a strong smell of blood. Barton seemed to come to a realization, but he wasn't in the mood to think. He only wanted to leave this place and escape the danger that was about to erupt. However, Pacheco was rather calm. He looked at Vernal and asked warmly, "You've been visiting Mr. Barton all this while, and writing letters to the Foundation. What kind of help do you want us to provide?" Upon hearing this, Barton was taken aback. If it were another occasion, he would definitely imagine that Pacheco was asking what kind of legal advice Vernal needed. At a time like this, didn't he only have two options? He could either escape and report this to the police, or take out his weapon and fire a bullet at Vernal or smack him in the head with a pole. Barton was full of doubts about Pacheco's way of handling things. With faint white fog lingering at the tip of his nose, and with his eyes that were glowing with gray light, Vernal didn't show any resistance to this kind of exchange. His expression became solemn as he replied in a dignified tone, "Two things. First, bring this item to the suburbs and return in the evening." While speaking, Vernal threw a glass bottle with a slender neck. The glass bottle seemed to be very sturdy. Even when it fell to the ground, it didn't seem damaged at all despite hitting a rock. Its interior was filled with pale white, thin, almost illusory fog.
At that moment, Barton acutely sensed that the body of this deputy director of the compliance department had stiffened a little, as though he had sensed something unusual.
Vernal didn't observe their reactions and continued, "Secondly, when you are searching for ancient artifacts, help me find similar items." As he spoke, he took out a piece of paper and spread it open.
There was a strange-looking lamp on the paper.
It was like a tiny water flask that had a candlewick extend out of its mouth. "No problem." After 2 seconds of silence, Pacheco replied in a low voice, one different from his previous tone. "That's good. Haha, don't you think that our encounter was a coincidence?" Then Vernal tossed the piece of paper aside and leaped up high onto the half-collapsed building. He was like a baboon as he nimbly climbed up and jumped, quickly disappearing from Barton's and Pacheco's sights. "What are we going to do next?" Barton turned to look at the deputy director of the compliance department. Before he could finish speaking, he suddenly stopped. He realized that Pacheco was still standing there, breathing heavily. In addition to that, Pacheco's body was covered with thick black fur. His muscles swelled up, causing the black coat to tighten. "Monster! Monster!" Barton's eyes widened as if he wanted to see clearly Pacheco's current appearance. In the blink of an eye, the abnormality on Pacheco vanished. He let out a long breath and said, "We'll wait here." "Do you need to pick them up?" Barton pointed at the bottle and paper on the ground. The corners of Pacheco's mouth twitched as he said, "You can pick it up, but you have to keep a distance from me later." Barton blurted out, "Will the fog in that glass bottle affect you? There are things that even if you can't be certain about, it's best to not rashly attempt them." Pacheco still didn't give a direct answer. It's really tiring to communicate with him. After pondering for a while, Barton took a few steps forward and stopped in front of the bottle and paper. Just as he bent down to grab the 2 items, his eyes suddenly lit up with a weak light. Immediately after, a pair of boots appeared before his eyes. The front of one of the boots was curled up high. The other was similar to the rounded top boots that were popular nowadays, as though they belonged to 2 different people. Barton's heart tightened. He suddenly straightened his body and looked forward. There was a lady standing opposite him. This lady was wearing clothes that could be considered as 2 dresses. One side was complex and the other was simple. One side was colorful, and the other side pure black. This asymmetrical attire made Barton flare up instinctively. He wanted to tear off her clothes and give her a normal dress and a pair of normal boots. This impulsiveness didn't contain any trace of a male's desire to harm women. It was purely because of his disgust and repugnant feeling towards such a sense of aesthetics. After enduring the discomfort, Barton cast his gaze at the lady's head. She had a pretty face, a high nose bridge, full lips, and a pair of dark gray eyes that were rarely seen. She looked to be in her 20s. Barton didn't feel any amazement. Instead, he felt that the lady's appearance was rather strange. After a few seconds, he finally understood the reason. The lady's face was devoid of expression, unlike a real person. It was closer to a wax statue. Vernal has already left. The deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco, seemed to have completely recovered and took the initiative to speak. The lady's gaze swept across the bottle and paper in Barton's hand. "What does he want you to do?" "Bring this bottle to the suburbs and return only in the evening. Also, we are to help him find the item drawn on the paper," Pacheco answered frankly, putting on an attitude as though he was unwilling to be the lady's enemy. The lady nodded and said, "Give me the bottle." As soon as she finished speaking, Barton seemed to have heard an order that couldn't be disobeyed. He instinctively threw the thin-necked bottle in his hand at the other party. Pacheco seized this opportunity and asked, "You're a member of the Tamara family?" The lady caught the bottle and looked down. "I didn't expect anyone to remember us," Pacheco replied with a smile. "In truth, from the end of the 4th epoch until now, there have always been active members of the Tamara family, but there are very few of them. Have you heard of the Theosophy Order?" "They are them. We are us," the lady answered simply before her body rapidly faded away and vanished. Chapter 1401 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 7/8 After seeing the lady disappear for a few seconds, Pacheco turned his head and said to Barton, "Let's go back to the Foundation." "Aren't we going to the suburbs?" Barton asked subconsciously. Pacheco said with a smile, "Didn't you already give the bottle away? We no longer have a reason to go to the suburbs."
Perhaps his true aim was for us to hand the bottle to the lady of the Tamara family.
What he said before were all lies. Of course, this has nothing to do with us. Next, there is no innocent party among them, so it doesn't matter who dies. All we need to do is perform a certain amount of surveillance to prevent their battle from affecting ordinary people. This will be handled by the police, not by the Foundation or the compliance department. Vernal doesn't look like he's capable of this kind of devious plot. Barton mumbled.
He didn't ask further and turned to walk out the door.
Frankly speaking, returning to the Foundation was the answer he wanted to hear the most. It was just a spur of the moment when he asked if they were heading to the suburbs. It was an old habit he hadn't overcome for many years. After returning to the Foundation, Barton spent the rest of the day feeling rather uneasy. He went through the menial, repetitive routine until evening came. I originally felt that life was too boring, but I now realize that a monotonous life is so precious. Sigh, I only hope that nothing unexpected happens like in the afternoon. May the Lord bless me. Barton stopped at his doorstep, stretched out his right hand, clenched his fist, and gently struck his left chest. After finishing his prayer, he opened the door and entered. He took off his hat, coat, and handed them over to his wife who had come forward. What happened to Vernal? His wife asked carefully. Barton replied calmly in both tone and expression. He offended some people and was being followed. The police have taken over this matter. In the future, if Vernal visits again, don't let him in. Remember to send someone to inform the police. Barton's wife heaved a sigh of relief when she heard that the police had intervened. All right. After dinner, Barton played with his children for a while before finding an excuse to go to his study and sit near the window. He needed a private space to completely calm his emotions and walk out of the panic brought about by the incident with Vernal. As such, Barton took out a cigarette from his drawer and put it to his mouth. He wasn't addicted to smoking, but he had to socialize sometimes, so he prepared a pack of cigarettes at home and on his body. He lit the matchstick, lit the cigarette, and took a deep suck. He then leaned back in his chair and watched the smoke coming out from his mouth and nose. The white gas quickly spread out in all directions, making Barton suddenly think of the fog coming out of Vernal's mouth and nose. He vaguely smelled the faint scent of blood. To Barton, this wasn't a very strange discovery. After all, Vernal had stayed in his study before, so he definitely left some traces behind. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to detect him. Barton didn't smell it before, but because he was too nervous and flustered, his attention had been focused on the whereabouts of Vernal and the words he had left behind. Of course, the smell of blood in the study room was very faint. It was also one of the reasons why it couldn't compare with the hotel room and the burnt ruins at all. As the smoke from the cigarette spread, Barton suddenly narrowed his eyes. He had an ominous feeling. In an instant, the pale white gas shrank in a certain direction with the smell of blood, forming a figure. The figure's upper body was normal with an iconic red nose. It was none other than the archaeologist, Vernal. The lower half of his body was completely shrouded in air, like a monster drawn out by smoke. "V. Vernal," Barton shouted, almost suffocating. His voice reverberated in the study, unable to penetrate the wall. "Haha, I've already acquired an immortal body. As long as there's still some fog left, I'll be able to come back to life." Vernal burst into laughter. Compared to before, his expression became more and more crazed, and his eyes seemed to be slightly palish white. He was already dead just now? This thought subconsciously flashed across Barton's mind. Then, he forced himself to remain calm and said, "What's the matter?" As he spoke, Barton wanted to stand up on impulse, but sadly he discovered that his body was covered by a cold and thin fog, and he had lost most of his senses. Vernal stopped laughing and looked into Barton's eyes. He said word by word, "You didn't bring that bottle to the suburbs." Although Barton had a rash personality, he knew that he couldn't answer this question directly. He quickly thought of a solution. A few seconds later, he changed the topic before he spoke again. "Why did you convert to believing in that entity? Aren't you a loyal believer of the Lord?" Vernal fell silent for a moment before his expression gradually became fervent. "I've seen an even larger world, a much more vast world. Compared to that, the planet we are currently living on is like a grain of sand in the desert. There are innumerable civilizations, ancient ruins left behind from hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, or even tens of millions of years ago. This is what the universe looks like." Seeing that his question only made things worse, Barton fell silent. He thought about whether there were any non-sensitive topics that would garner Vernal's interest. He slowly took a deep breath and said, "Other than the altar, what else did you discover at the fourth epic ruin? How much do you know of the Tamara family?" Vernal's eyes lit up. The Tamara family had its coat of arms replaced once.
This means that they had encountered something rather major.
As he spoke, the archaeologist who was just an upper half of a body had extended his right hand. Using the smoke, he drew out two symbols in midair. The first symbol was formed from a layer of brambles, a shield wall, and a long sword that was vertically inserted into them from above. The main part of the second symbol was a pair of double doors that swung open, and the gap in the middle was taken up by the vertical long sword. As a barely famous historian, Barton immediately thought of the words of the Tamara family member. "They are them. We are us." Did the Tamara family fracture? Barton blurted out. "I thought so," said Vernal, smiling with gratification. Then he leaned close to Barton, his face burning with zeal. "Your brain is more tempting than I imagined, and it's the best supplement for me. Relax a little. Your mind will merge with mine, and we can witness those great civilizations together." He looked very weak and eager to recover. Barton's heart thumped wildly, and he tried his best to avoid the other party. But no matter how hard he struggled, his body seemed to freeze. He was unable to move at all. Just as he was about to close his eyes, Barton suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right hand, and he immediately regained consciousness. The pale white fog in front of him and the monster-like Vernal disappeared as if they had never appeared. Barton lowered his head numbly and saw that the cigarette in his right hand had reached its limit, burning his fingers. It was a dream? But I found it so realistic. Barton threw away the cigarette in his hand and instinctively stood up using his spirituality and walked to the window. He looked out at the streets and saw that under the street lamps, many pedestrians were passing by in the darkness, wanting to rush home as soon as possible. Among them, an ordinary golden retriever was taking a casual stroll. Chapter 1402 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 8/8 The scene in front of him was so ordinary that Barton didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. Although he vaguely felt that there was something familiar about it, he didn't think that it was worth puzzling over it. How could a daily scene not be familiar? His gaze shifted as he looked up into the sky. He saw the crimson moon quietly hanging in the sky, shining with light, causing his mood to settle down involuntarily. At that moment, Barton seemed to have let go of an invisible burden. His body and mind were unusually relaxed. He no longer had the same fear, anxiety, and frustration from before. His spiritual intuition told him that Vernal's matter had come to an end, and it would no longer affect his life. Holy Lord of Storms. Lord, thank you for your blessings. Barton immediately struck his left chest with his right fist and muttered to himself. Without anxiety and tension, he felt exhaustion overwhelm him like a flood. It surged from the depths of his soul, drowning his brain, limbs, and every cell in his body. Barton couldn't help but use the back of his hand to cover his mouth. He yawned, but a satisfied smile appeared on his face. He didn't stay in the study any longer and turned around to leave. He returned to the bedroom and took a pleasant bath, enjoying himself as he drank a small glass of red wine. That night, Barton didn't dream anymore and slept exceptionally soundly. When he woke up in the morning, his mind was relaxed and his spirits were rising. It was as if he had obtained a new life. Looking at his wife who was still sleeping beside him, Barton carefully got up, changed his clothes, and walked around the neighborhood. He had never realized how wonderful his district was. The air was fresh, the environment was peaceful, and the scenery was pleasant. Even the pedestrians were cultured. This made Barton's mood even better. Once again, he deeply understood that the matter with Vernal had come to an end, and he had returned to his normal peaceful life. He maintained his mood and went home to enjoy breakfast with his wife and children. During this process, he even told his wife about a joke he read in the newspapers and fulfilled his children's tiny requests. Seeing the smiles on his wife and children's faces, Barton felt satisfied. Then, he put on his coat, hat, and cane before heading out to take a trackless public carriage. He walked all the way to the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation at the periphery of the city. After entering his office, Barton found his usual daily pace. He didn't get right down to work but prepared the special herbal black tea he had prepared himself. With the black tea, he leisurely read the newspapers that he didn't subscribe to at home. Then,
He picked up the letters and documents he had received and read them. Such a process and pace made him feel exceptionally comfortable. The only difference was that Barton was still a little worried about receiving yet another letter from Vernal. However, this concern didn't turn into a reality. About 15 minutes later, someone knocked on his office door. "Please come in." Barton picked up his cup and took a sip of his black tea. The person who entered was the ordinary-looking deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco Duane, who didn't have any characteristics that stood out but still managed to give off a warm and friendly vibe. "Did you sleep well last night?" asked Pacheco as he stood at the door. "Excellent." Barton didn't hide anything. Pacheco nodded and smiled. "Seems like you've really gotten rid of the effects from this matter." Barton didn't mention the nightmare he had had. Instead, he asked, "What about you?" "I also slept very well," Pacheco replied with a smile. "The police have already taken over this matter. It said that they found Vernal last night. Unfortunately, he apparently encountered some misfortune. Poor soul, I hope he can rest in peace." Barton didn't pray that the Lord would protect him, because Vernal had already abandoned his faith in the Lord of Storms. If there were really any blessings to be bestowed, then it would definitely be lightning blasts and storms. With that said, he thought of the help that Pacheco had provided and his friendly attitude. He said, "Shall we have lunch together later?" "Are you treating?" asked Pacheco with a smile. "Of course. It's a pleasure to meet a friend like you." Barton stood up and bowed gentlemanly. Pacheco nodded slightly and said, "Then I'll wait at the compliance department for your invitation." "Before 12? No problem." Apart from being grateful to him, Barton also felt that knowing the deputy director of the compliance department would be a great help to his future work. Furthermore, he believed that Pacheco was just like him. In some aspects, he was stronger than the average person. After seeing Pacheco leave his office, Barton sat down again, silently and slowly exhaling. As an ordinary person with a normal IQ, he could tell that the matters regarding Vernal were very strange. It involved the problems of mysticism and religion. In addition, he was actually very interested in the details of the Tamara family's fracturing and the secret history of the Fourth Epoch, and the details to which Vernal had encountered. However, he knew that he couldn't probe further. It was thanks to the great luck of an ordinary person for him to be able to see the tip of the iceberg without dying. If he wanted to figure out the situation beneath the water surface, he would definitely drown to death. The past archaeological expedition made Barton not dare to take the risk, nor did he want to take any risks. To him, curiosity was probably the most worthless thing. After pondering for a while, Barton continued his work. When it was almost noon, he tidied the items on the table and picked up the coat and top hat hanging on the clothes rack. He left the office and walked to the door of the compliance department. Knock, knock, knock. Barton knocked on the wooden door in front of him. Soon, Pacheco opened the door and glanced at Barton. "Give me another 5 minutes. I still have some matters to settle." "No problem." Barton didn't mind at all. "Come on in and wait," Pacheco said casually. Barton didn't stand on ceremony. He walked into the compliance department and found a chair to sit down. As his gaze moved, he realized that there were about 6 to 7 members in the compliance department. Just then, he heard someone knocking on the door. Without waiting for the employees of the compliance department to get up, the door creaked open. The first to enter was the vice president of the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. He was a lively old man. He looked around and paused for a second before saying, "Seems like everyone is here. Let me introduce you to a new colleague." As he spoke, the vice president took a few steps forward, revealing the new employee of the compliance department behind him. She was a woman in her 20s. She had a high nose bridge and a pair of moist, full lips. Her eyes were dark gray and her face was pretty. She wore a common blue dress. However, there was no expression on her face. She didn't look like a real person. She looked more like a wax statue. The gazes of Barton and Pacheco froze. The vice president continued smiling and said, "She will be like Pacheco, taking on the role of the deputy director of the compliance department. Her name is Alicia Tamara." The end to an ordinary person's daily life. Author's note. There's no way to go in-depth in the end to an ordinary person's daily life. This is just a showcase of the tip of the iceberg without going deep. Yes, it's also an experimental form of narrating the story. If the ending is meant to have the effect of horror without any consideration of values, then it will be written as such. As he spoke, the vice president took a few steps forward,
revealing the new employee of the compliance department behind him. She was a woman in her 20s. She had a high nose bridge and a pair of moist, full lips. Her eyes were dark gray and her face was pretty. She wore a common blue dress. The gazes of Barton and Pacheco froze. At that moment, the lady's lips curled up as she said with a radiant smile, "Hello everyone. I'm Alicia Tamara." Chapter 1403 In Modern Day 1 I'm an ordinary company employee. My greatest joy every day is that I can clock off on time. This isn't something that can be realized often, because it's only from working overtime that I can receive a higher salary. Only from doing so can I gain a little sense of security. In this aspect, my boss isn't that bad. At the very least, he'll pay for overtime, unlike the company next door who only knows how to shout slogans. All they do is pump up the employees without sparing a single penny. Based on my observations, they aren't far from closing down, because their boss is already trying to sell off second-hand computers on his WeChat moments. This isn't something I discovered. I'm not friends with their boss on WeChat. This comes from the mouths of the employees. In this world, it's sexist to say that there's gossip where there are women present. Instead, there's gossip wherever there are people. Of course, I don't have absolute confidence in those words. There was once a time when a dog and a cat made me feel that they were watching us humans with amusement and gossiping. Just like now, the golden retriever that always appears near my office building is sitting at the entrance. Seriously, looking at the grooming of its fur, it doesn't look like it doesn't have a master. How can someone walk a dog without a leash? This kind of person shouldn't be rearing pets. They have no morals at all. There's a necklace around its neck, a rope, and the end of the rope is in its mouth. As I mumble, I recall of an emoticon that has been trending online. It has strong self-control. I snort and cast my eyes beyond the glass doors. The sky is so dark, and large beads of raindrops pummel through the stuffy humid environment and crash into the ground. Fuck, it rained so quickly. At this moment, I want to question God. It hadn't been easy for me to get off work on time today. To think that I would encounter a storm. Furthermore, I didn't bring an umbrella with me. Back when I was in the office, I noticed that it was dark and gloomy outside and knew that a storm was coming, but I thought I had enough time to get to the bus stop. By the time my bus arrives close to my rented apartment, the rain should have stopped or be reduced to a drizzle. After all, it's summer and the rain comes and goes quickly. I can't help but raise my middle finger at God. Helpless, I turn my head to look at the golden retriever by the door and casually say, "You didn't bring an umbrella as well?" That was just a self-deprecating comment of mine, but the next moment I'm shocked. The big golden retriever rolls its eyes at me. It rolled its eyes at me. Its eyes. I knew it. This dog has some humanity in it. I look away and mutter. I examine the storm outside again, wondering if I should just run to the bus stop. I sniff and considering how I haven't recovered fully from my cold, I hold back the urge. Sigh, as a grown man, isn't it normal to only bring a phone, a transportation card, and a key access card? Who would carry a bag and have an umbrella inside for no reason? These days, I don't even keep change on me. Forget it. I'll just go back to the office and kill time. I'll browse through websites and wait until the rain becomes a drizzle before I leave. If it really doesn't pan out as I expect, then I'll order takeout. I sigh and turn to walk to the elevator. Suddenly, I notice an additional vending machine in one corner of the building lobby. Summon coffee? I suddenly feel like drinking something. I did as I thought. With the financial freedom to buy beverages below 10 yuan, I confidently walk over to the vending machine and take a gander at the beverages on sale. My Zone, Nongfu Spring, Master Kong Iced Tea, and Jasmine Tea. I notice something strange when I look through the beverages on display. It's a box, placed in the corner of the topmost row of beverages. What the hell? I glance at the screen and read the scrolling images and text. Soon, I understand what the box is. It's the recently popular real-life loot box. There are loot boxes even with beverages these days? It really is a tax on one's intelligence. Gambling is indeed exciting. I mutter as I scan what possible contents might be in the loot box. Damn, this is interesting. This loot box is actually related to a new beverage product. It has never appeared on the market before, the bottle has a unique design, and the names are very stylish. Seer, Apprentice, Bard, Warrior, Sleepless. I like that. There's also lawyer, assassin, hunter. I glance at the price of the loot box and realize that it only costs 5 yuan. It's cheaper than I expected, so I decide to give it a try. Life is short, so why not give it a try? As a slave of society, the daily working hours go from 9 to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Excluding work time, eating, sleeping and commuting, there's very little free time for leisure. Even the monotonous life would get to robots with this happening day after day. It's just so boring. The property prices are even more depressing. They make you lose the motivation to work hard. One becomes dejected or just takes on a mantra of letting things come as they may. To be able to find a new thrill in cheap forms of entertainment other than novels, comics, videos, and games can be considered a surprise. Taking my phone out, I start scanning the QR code. At the same time, I mutter a few names in my mind. Seer, Sleepless, Spectator, Assassin. These are the beverages that I hope for the most from the loot box. I will be satisfied as long as it's one of them. After paying, the vending machine seemed to be stuck. It didn't move for quite a while. I suspect that it's trying to cheat me. Is it packaging it on the spot? I complain as I seriously consider making a complaint. At this moment, the vending machine finally showed signs of movement. The loot box is pushed out and falls to the dispenser with a thud. It's time to witness a miracle. I bend down and push open the sliding panel of the dispenser and pull out the loot box that I really can't consider exquisitely packaged. After I quickly open the box, I see a bottle wrapped in coiled snakes. Based on what I saw on the screen, I'm able to recognize which drink it is. As an Assassin's Creed gamer, this is an outcome I've been looking forward to. Assassin. Chapter 1404 In Modern Day Too Nice. I can't help but snap my fingers with my free hand. As someone who has never even won a consolation prize, to be able to get a beverage I wanted is simply exciting. Furthermore, the most important thing is that I only spent 5 yuan. Otherwise, I'll definitely hit it trying it 10 times in a row. I need to keep this bottle well. I put away my phone, open the can, and take a mouthful of the beverage. In the next second, my head suddenly turns a little numb. I feel like everything around me has become abnormally blurry, and my entire body becomes light as though I'm about to turn into a feather. In this strange feeling, I vaguely hear muffled ravings that sound like fingernails scratching a blackboard. The taste of a demoness ain't bad. The taste of a demoness ain't bad. The taste of a demoness ain't bad. This brings an indescribable pain, and I lose all my ability to think. By the time the torture ends, I can't remember what happened towards the end, but I know that my face must have been very twisted and hideous. Fuck. What the hell is this beverage? I turn angrily to look at the vending machine. At that moment, my head is spinning, and my eyes swell. I have the feeling that I'll collapse at any moment. However, this doesn't stop me from discovering a fact. The vending machine that still existed moments ago has disappeared. Holy shit. I can't take my spinning head and the soreness in my eyes. I quickly remove my glasses and prepare to squeeze my nose bridge. However, just as I take off my glasses, everything returns to normal. My head doesn't spin and my eyes no longer ache. My vision remains clear, clearer than even before my myopia. I scan my surroundings, and every detail is reflected in my eyes. Even a dozen meters away, a mosquito silently suspended on a black stone is vividly clear. I've recovered from my short-sightedness? That bout of fainting was because of the glasses? I glance around once more, and for some reason, I feel that my vision has exceeded that of a normal person's. As I try hard to recall, I gradually come to a realization. I can change part of my body structure for a short amount of time. I can obtain feather-like lightness. Even if I jump from high above, I won't be hurt. A hawk-like vision that allows me to see through the darkness. I'm good at hiding in the shadows. My steps are nimble and my body is agile. The instantaneous strength I can release is tremendous. I can concentrate all my strength into a single strike. As I suspect that the assassin beverage that I had just taken was actually some mental drug that gives me hallucinations. I also feel that something might have really happened due to my recovery from short-sightedness. I put on my glasses again and realize that it does leave me faint. No way this is real. The vending machine is gone. It was still there a moment ago. Did I have a fortuitous encounter? I cast my gaze out of the lobby and see people carrying umbrellas or have their backpacks raised in the heavy rain, running about in a hurry. Before this, I could only barely see silhouettes in this scene, but now, I can confirm the features of every pedestrian. Of course, the prerequisite is that they aren't wearing face masks. A fortuitous encounter. Don't tell me it's really a fortuitous encounter. I would occasionally fantasize about having a fortuitous encounter, for example, striking lottery worth 10 to 20 million yuan, but I never expected such a day. Moreover, it's the assassin ability that I wanted the most. Even if it's fake, just healing my short-sightedness makes me give this fortuitous encounter full marks. I control my excitement and joy and carefully examine my body. After confirming that there's nothing wrong with it, I close my eyes and mutter to myself, "Thank you, God. Thank you, vending machine. Thank you, loot box." I have to find a place to test the leap of faith. I've recovered from my cold too. I'll think further about it after the rain stops. I look around again, eager to test what it means to have dexterous steps, agility, and explosive power. Of course, as a normal person with regular intelligence, I know that I should avoid others in times like this, lest I expose my fortuitous encounter and create a series of unknown developments. At this moment, due to the heavy rain, the people inside the building either have to work overtime or have already left. Those without umbrellas either have realized the reality of things or haven't left the office. They either return to the office or bravely run to the bus stop. Therefore, other than the 2 security guards who have their backs to me, there's no one else in the lobby. I can give it a try. Yes, there's a dog. So what if I'm seen by a dog? It doesn't understand anything. Would it be able to tell anyone? I immediately widen my pace and run toward the elevator. I can feel the changes in my body. Using a machine as an analogy, my body used to be a rusted machine that had been soaked in water. Now it was a new lubricated machine. A few steps later, I suddenly remember something. Previously, several companies in the building had been a victim of theft. Through the surveillance cameras, the police found the criminal. In other words, there are surveillance cameras in the lobby, and my every move is being monitored. Bear with it, bear with it. I stop my attempts and turn back to look at the spots where there might be cameras. My gaze sweeps across the huge golden retriever at the door. It's still impassively looking at the rain outside. I'll wait till I get home. I let out a slow sigh, hold my glasses, and head for the elevator. I heard from my gossiping colleagues at the company that the theft was done by a young rag-and-bone man from nearby. In the past, this guy was the son of a rich man. Later on, his family waned, and he could only make a living being a rag-and-bone man. However, the police never found him. I take the elevator and go back to the 10th floor. My mind is filled with how to be an assassin hiding in the city's shadows. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. I mutter a few slogans and exit the elevator. Glancing around, I see a figure standing by the window at the elevator lobby. He has rare, long silver hair. His features are very distinctive. So I recognize him. He's the vice president of the company next door, whose surname is Wu. Of course, this might only be his Chinese surname, because he's either a foreigner or a mixed blood. It's such a pity that this guy isn't an idol. He's so good-looking that even the girls in our company often try to, coincidentally, bump into him. They give him flowers and food. It's like he has everything easy in the game of life. The boss next door really has bad taste. With such an employee, I'd have long changed to running an entertainment company. I don't know what the company next door is busy with every day. Until today, I don't even know what they do. All of them are garrulous, completely unlike Roseanne when she's joking. They're probably doing multi-level marketing, right? I quickly retract my gaze and not greet him. After all, we're not familiar with each other. But just at this moment, I see that guy turn around and walk over. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.